I worked in the court for years, until the king saw the scars on my back and went feral. When Alpha King Kieran found his chancellor holding a red-hot iron to Sera's flesh, every civilized restraint shattered. The diplomatic ruler became something far more dangerous, a man whose protective fury would either save his kingdom or destroy it. When a king trades wisdom for primal justice, does he become the monster he's fighting, or the protector his people need? Chapter 1. The Perfect Chancellor. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of Ravenshollow's great hall, casting jeweled patterns across the ancient stone floor where Alpha King Kieran held court. At 32, he commanded the room with the natural authority of a man born to rule, his dark hair catching the light as he listened to Chancellor Morgana present the day's business with her characteristic efficiency. "The grain stores are adequate for winter, Your Majesty," Morgana reported, her auburn hair perfectly arranged beneath a circlet of silver that marked her elevated status. "The harvest taxes from the northern provinces have exceeded expectations, and the treasury remains stable despite the costs of recent border fortifications." Kieran nodded approvingly, grateful once again for the woman who had transformed his court from chaotic inefficiency into a well-oiled machine of governance. Since her appointment 3 years ago, following the previous chancellor's hunting accident, Morgana had proven herself indispensable. Her noble birth, sharp intellect, and unwavering loyalty to the crown had made her the most trusted advisor in his council. "Excellent work, as always," he said, noting how the other nobles deferred to her judgment. "What of the diplomatic correspondence from the Eastern Kingdoms?" "Prince Marcus of Westmarch continues to press for trade negotiations, though his terms remain unfavorable. I've prepared counter-proposals that better serve our interests." She gestured elegantly to a servant carrying documents. "The details await your review in your private chambers." As the servant approached, a young woman with striking violet eyes, Kieran found himself momentarily distracted. There was something ethereal about her beauty, despite the plain gray dress that marked her lowly station. She moved with unusual grace for someone of common birth, her dark hair pinned back severely, revealing a face that would have been stunning if not shadowed by what appeared to be perpetual fear. "Thank you," he said gently as she placed the documents before him, noting how her hands trembled slightly. When their eyes met briefly, he saw intelligence there, quickly hidden behind lowered lashes. "Sera serves as my personal assistant," Morgana explained, her tone carrying subtle disapproval. "Orphaned during the border conflicts, taken in by the castle's charity. She's adequate for simple tasks, though somewhat limited in her capabilities." The girl, Sera, said nothing, merely curtsying deeply before retreating to the shadows beside Morgana's chair. Something in her posture suggested years of training in invisibility, of learning to occupy space without drawing attention. "The border conflicts claimed many innocents," Kieran observed, watching as Chancellor Morgana's expression flickered almost imperceptibly when he showed interest in the servant. "It speaks well of our Christian duty, that the castle provides sanctuary for those left homeless by war." "Indeed, Your Majesty, though sometimes charity requires firm guidance to ensure proper gratitude and behavior." Morgana's smile remained perfect, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Shall we proceed to the matter of the new tax assessments?" The business of kingship continued, but Kieran found his attention occasionally drifting to the silent figure beside his chancellor's chair. Sera remained motionless, hands clasped, eyes downcast, yet he sensed an alertness in her stillness that spoke of constant vigilance. When Morgana spoke, the girl seemed to shrink slightly, as if expecting some form of correction or punishment. "It was probably nothing. Servants often maintained deferential postures in the presence of authority. Yet something about the interaction struck him as odd, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. Perhaps it was the way Sera's breathing seemed to quicken whenever Morgana addressed her directly, or how her violet eyes occasionally darted toward the exits as if calculating escape routes. "Your Majesty?" Morgana's voice recalled his wandering attention. "The assessments?" "Of course. Please continue." As the morning wore on, Kieran forced himself to focus on matters of state, pushing aside his inexplicable interest in a servant whose circumstances were undoubtedly similar to dozens of others throughout his castle. He had more pressing concerns than the welfare of every orphan his charity had rescued from the chaos of war. Yet, when the session concluded and the great hall emptied, he found himself wondering about violet eyes and trembling hands, about the fear that seemed to emanate from someone who should have felt grateful for sanctuary, rather than terrified of those who provided it. It was probably nothing. Morgana's judgment in household matters had always been sound, and if she vouched for the girl's adequate service, that should be sufficient. Still, the nagging sense that something was amiss lingered as he made his way to his private chambers, where documents awaited his attention and the business of ruling continued its relentless demands. Chapter 2. The Invisible Girl. The evening feast filled Ravenshallow's great hall with warmth and celebration as nobles from across the kingdom gathered to honor the feast of St. Michael. Kieran observed the festivities from the high table, noting with satisfaction how seamlessly his court functioned under Morgana's expert management. Every detail had been perfectly orchestrated, from the placement of visiting dignitaries to the precise timing of each course. Servants moved through the hall like ghosts, appearing when needed and vanishing when their tasks were complete. It was during the third course that Kieran spotted her again, the violet-eyed girl from the morning's council session. She carried a silver pitcher of wine, refilling goblets with practiced efficiency while remaining virtually invisible to the nobles she served. "The harvest celebration appears most successful," observed Lord Garrett, the aging castellan who had served Kieran's father. "Chancellor Morgana's organizational skills continue to impress." Indeed. Kieran accepted more wine from Sera as she appeared beside his chair, noting again the careful way she moved, as if afraid of drawing attention. "Tell me, Garrett, what do you know of the girl?" "Girl, Your Majesty?" "The servant with the violet eyes. Sera, I believe Morgana called her." Lord Garrett squinted across the hall, then shrugged. "Kitchen staff, I imagine. There are so many orphans from the border troubles, it's difficult to keep track. Chancellor Morgana has handled all household assignments since she took office. Efficient system. Removes such trivial concerns from Your Majesty's attention." Trivial. Yet Kieran found himself watching Sera's movements throughout the evening, struck by contradictions he couldn't quite name. Her posture spoke of noble training. The straight spine, the precise movements, the way she held her head despite keeping her eyes downcast. Yet she wore the rough gray wool of a common servant and performed menial tasks with the skill of long practice. When she approached a table of young knights, her entire demeanor shifted subtly. Where she had moved with quiet confidence before, now she seemed to shrink, her steps becoming hurried and nervous. One of the knights, Sir Edmund, a brash young man known for his cruel humor, gestured dismissively as she poured his wine. "Careful, girl. This vintage costs more than your annual wages." His companions laughed as Sera's hands trembled slightly. "Perhaps you should practice on the servants' tables before attempting to serve your betters." From his elevated position, Kieran watched color rise in Sera's cheeks, but she merely curtsied and murmured an apology. There was dignity in her response, a composure that seemed at odds with her supposed station. Most servants would have either cowered or shown some spark of resentment, but Sera displayed neither reaction, just careful, practiced submission that spoke of extensive training in enduring humiliation. "Edmund grows more insufferable with each passing year," Lord Garrett muttered. "His father spoiled him terribly before the fever took them both. Perhaps he requires a reminder of proper behavior toward those under our protection," Kieran said, his voice carrying an edge that made the older man glance at him with surprise. "Of course, Your Majesty. Though servants must learn to tolerate minor discourtesies. It builds character, as my own father used to say." Character. Kieran wondered what sort of character was built through systematic humiliation versus what was revealed when someone maintained grace under such treatment. Throughout the evening, he found himself noting other interactions, how Sera seemed to anticipate needs before they were voiced, how she navigated through crowds without ever brushing against a guest, how she became nearly invisible while remaining attentive to her duties. Near the evening's end, as nobles began retiring to their chambers, Kieran caught sight of Chancellor Morgana speaking quietly with Sera near the servants' entrance. Though he couldn't hear their words over the hall's ambient noise, he observed their body language with growing interest. Morgana's posture was commanding, authoritative, while Sera stood perfectly still, hands clasped, head bowed. When Morgana gestured, Sera flinched almost imperceptibly, a reaction so subtle that someone not specifically watching would have missed it entirely. Then Morgana placed her hand on Sera's shoulder, and the girl went rigid. It was a brief touch, lasting perhaps 3 seconds, but Sera's reaction was unmistakable. Her breathing became shallow, her skin pale, and when Morgana removed her hand, there was relief in the line of Sera's shoulders. Interesting. Whatever their relationship, it extended beyond simple professional courtesy between superior and subordinate. The fear Kieran had noticed that morning seemed far more specific and personal than general servile anxiety. "Your Majesty appears deep in thought," Morgana's voice interrupted his observation. She had approached the high table while he was watching the interaction, leaving Sera to disappear through the servants' entrance. "The evening has been most successful," he replied diplomatically. "Your attention to detail continues to exceed expectations. High standards must be maintained, Your Majesty, in all things." Her smile was perfect, but her emerald eyes held something calculating. "Discipline and order create the foundation upon which greatness is built." "Discipline," he repeated thoughtfully. "And how do you maintain such standards among the household staff?" "Firm guidance, clear expectations, and immediate correction of deficiencies. The orphans we've taken in require particular attention. Their backgrounds often lack proper training in service or respect for authority. But with patience and consistent discipline, even the most challenging cases can be molded into adequate servants." There was something in her tone when she mentioned challenging cases that made Kieran wonder if she was referring to someone specific. "I imagine such work requires considerable personal attention." "Indeed, some individuals require more intensive guidance than others, but the results justify the effort invested." She paused, studying his expression. "Was there some particular aspect of household management that concerned Your Majesty?" The question was phrased politely, but he sensed an underlying tension. "Merely curious about the welfare of those under our protection. Noblesse oblige, as they say." "Of course, Your Majesty's concern for the least of your subjects reflects the nobility of your character. I assure you that every member of our household receives exactly the treatment they deserve." The treatment they deserve. An interesting choice of words. Chapter 3. The question ignored. The following morning brought autumn rain that drummed against the diamond-paned windows of the royal study, where Kieran reviewed reports from his stewards while Chancellor Morgana organized correspondence by priority. The rhythmic sound of rainfall created a peaceful atmosphere for administrative work, broken only by the scratch of quills and occasional consultation between King and Chancellor. "The harvest reports from the western provinces show exceptional yields," Morgana noted, setting aside a thick sheaf of documents. "Lord Aldwin's innovations in crop rotation have proven remarkably successful. I've prepared recommendations for implementing similar practices across other holdings." Kieran nodded approvingly while his attention drifted to movement in the courtyard below. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see servants hurrying between buildings, their cloaks dark with moisture. Among them, he recognized a familiar figure, Sera, carrying what appeared to be heavy bundles of laundry despite the inclement weather. "The girl from yesterday evening," he said, gesturing toward the window. "Sera, she seems industrious despite the conditions." Morgana glanced briefly toward the courtyard, her expression neutral. "Laundry must be completed regardless of weather, Your Majesty. Delaying necessary tasks due to minor inconveniences creates problematic precedents." "Minor inconveniences." Kieran watched as Sera stumbled slightly under her burden, recovered gracefully, then continued toward what he assumed were the washing facilities. She appears quite young for such heavy labor. Perhaps older servants might be better suited to tasks requiring significant physical strength. Youth provides resilience, Your Majesty. The girl requires useful occupation to prevent idleness and its associated vices. Manual labor builds character while serving practical purposes. Morgana's tone carried subtle disapproval, as if his concern represented unnecessary sentiment. The castle's charitable obligations extend to providing guidance and purpose, not comfort and ease. Naturally. Yet there seems something refined about her bearing, almost as if she were born to a higher station than her current circumstances suggest. This observation caused Morgana to pause in her organization of documents, though she didn't look up from her work. Many refugees from the border conflicts carry themselves with false dignity, Your Majesty. Pride often proves the most difficult aspect of their former lives to surrender. Systematic correction of such attitudes becomes necessary for their own welfare. Systematic correction? Gentle but firm guidance toward appropriate humility and gratitude. Those accustomed to more comfortable circumstances sometimes require additional time to appreciate their current blessings. Sera, in particular, arrived with certain misconceptions about her importance that needed addressing. There was something in Morgana's tone, a satisfaction perhaps, that made Kieran study her more carefully. What sort of misconceptions? Nothing worthy of Your Majesty's concern. Childhood fantasies common among traumatized orphans, delusions of noble birth, romantic notions about her family's supposed importance. Such fantasies prevent proper adjustment to reality and must be discouraged through consistent application of truth. And how does one discourage such fantasies? Patience, repetition, and demonstration of actual circumstances versus imagined ones. She now understands her proper place and expresses appropriate gratitude for the sanctuary provided by your generosity. Kieran continued watching the courtyard, where Sera had disappeared into one of the outbuildings. Something about Morgana's explanation felt incomplete, though he couldn't identify exactly what troubled him. Does she have a family elsewhere? Others who might claim her? None living, Your Majesty. The border raids were thorough in their destruction. She arrived completely alone, with no possessions save the clothes she wore and stories no one could verify. Morgana's voice carried finality, discouraging further questions. Shall we review the correspondence from Archbishop Benedict? His concerns about heretical teachings in the northern parishes require immediate attention. The subject change was smoothly executed, but Kieran noticed it nonetheless. For someone supposedly unimportant, Sera seemed to generate considerable discussion whenever her name arose. Yet Morgana's explanations, while comprehensive, left him with more questions than answers. Of course, he agreed, accepting the Archbishop's letter while filing away his observations for future consideration. Though I wonder, if the girl shows aptitude beyond manual labor, perhaps advanced training might prove beneficial, teaching her to read, for instance, or instructing her in more skilled household management. Your Majesty's charitable instincts do you credit, Morgana replied carefully. However, experience suggests that elevation beyond one's natural station often produces unfortunate consequences. Sera has found stability and purpose in her current duties. Disrupting established routines might prove counterproductive to her continued progress. I see. But he didn't really. Most administrators would welcome opportunities to develop servant skills, creating more valuable household staff. Morgana's resistance seemed oddly possessive, as if she feared losing control over some particularly important asset. The Archbishop's letter mentions disturbing reports of mystical practices among the common folk, Morgana continued, successfully redirecting his attention. Superstitions that border on heresy, requiring immediate investigation and correction. For the remainder of the morning, they discussed ecclesiastical matters, trade negotiations, and preparations for the coming winter. Yet Kieran found himself occasionally glancing toward the courtyard, wondering about violet eyes and the stories they might tell if given voice. When their session concluded and Morgana departed with her usual efficiency, he remained in the study, staring out at the rain-soaked courtyard where Sera had vanished hours earlier. Something about their brief conversation had planted seeds of doubt, not about Morgana's competence, which remained unquestionable, but about the completeness of the information she provided. Perhaps it was time to seek other perspectives on the household's operations, not from suspicion, but from the simple desire to ensure that his castle truly served as sanctuary for those who needed protection, rather than merely shelter for those who could provide service. The rain continued falling, washing the courtyard clean while leaving questions that demanded answers. Chapter 4. The Accident. 3 days of persistent rain had finally given way to weak autumn sunshine when Kieran decided to inspect the castle's lower levels, areas he rarely visited, but which formed the foundation of daily life at Raven's Hollow. The kitchens, laundries, and storage chambers buzzed with activity as servants prepared for the evening feast, honoring visiting merchants from Flemish territories. He descended the narrow stone steps leading to the main kitchen, where head cook Margaret supervised the preparation of elaborate dishes designed to impress their foreign guests. The air filled with steam from multiple cauldrons, the scent of roasting meat, and the controlled chaos of professional food preparation. "Your Majesty!" Margaret's face flushed with surprise as she hastily wiped flour-covered hands on her apron. "We weren't expecting, that is, had we known you intended—" "Please, continue your work," Kieran assured her, genuinely interested in observing the complex operation that fed his household. "I've come merely to witness the skill that produces such excellent results." Margaret beamed with pride, launching into detailed explanations of each dish while servants scurried around them with practiced efficiency. It was during her description of the elaborate swan presentation that Kieran noticed Sera near the great hearth, carefully transferring heated wine from cauldron to serving vessels. She moved with the same graceful precision he'd observed during formal occasions, despite performing menial kitchen tasks. Her violet eyes remained focused on her work, but he sensed her awareness of his presence in the subtle tension of her shoulders. "The spiced wine requires precise temperature," Margaret was explaining. "Too hot burns the tongue. Too cool fails to release the aromatics. Young Sera has developed quite a talent for judging such matters." At the mention of her name, Sera glanced briefly toward them, meeting Kieran's eyes for perhaps 2 seconds before quickly returning attention to her task. In that brief moment, he again noted the intelligence that seemed at odds with her menial position. "She appears remarkably skilled for one so young," he observed. "Oh yes, Your Majesty. Quick to learn, careful with valuable ingredients, never wastes anything. A blessing to have such capable assistants during busy preparations." Margaret's praise was genuine, carrying none of the calculated diplomacy common in courtly conversations. Footsteps on the stone stairs announced another arrival, and Kieran turned to see Chancellor Morgana descending with her characteristic grace. Her expression showed mild surprise at finding him in the kitchens, though she quickly composed herself. "Your Majesty, I'd hoped to catch you before the afternoon council session. Lord Hamilton has sent urgent correspondence regarding the wool trade negotiations." "Of course." He moved to join her, noting peripherally how Sera's movements became more careful, more controlled upon Morgana's arrival. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like prey recognizing a predator's proximity. Morgana positioned herself near the wine preparation area, ostensibly to speak privately with the king while remaining close enough to oversee Sera's work. The merchant's feast should prove most advantageous for establishing new trading relationships. Every detail must reflect the sophistication of our court. Certainly. Margaret's preparations appear exemplary, as always. Kieran watched as Sera lifted another ladle of heated wine, her hands steady despite the presence of her ultimate superior. Indeed, though sometimes servants require direct supervision to maintain proper standards. Morgana moved slightly closer to where Sera worked, her positioning creating subtle pressure despite the casual nature of her movement. What happened next occurred so quickly that afterward, Kieran questioned whether he'd seen it correctly. Sera lifted the ladle, began transferring wine to the serving vessel, and suddenly jerked backward as if startled. Hot wine splashed across the stone floor, a few drops landing on Morgana's velvet slippers. "Clumsy girl." Morgana's voice carried sharp reproach as she stepped back from the spilled wine. "Such carelessness could have ruined my gown, or worse, injured someone seriously." Sera dropped to her knees immediately, grabbing nearby clothes to clean the spillage. "Forgive me, my lady. I don't know what happened. My hand just—" "Excuses serve no purpose," Morgana interrupted coldly. "Carelessness must be corrected immediately to prevent repetition." But Kieran had been watching carefully, positioned where he could observe both women's actions. From his angle, it appeared that Morgana had deliberately bumped Sera's elbow just as the ladle reached full extension, causing the spillage. Yet the movement had been so subtle, so perfectly timed, that anyone not specifically observing might easily believe it accidental. "Perhaps we should examine the injury," he suggested, noting how Sera's hands trembled as she cleaned the floor. "Hot wine can cause serious burns." "A few drops hardly constitute injury, Your Majesty," Morgana replied dismissively, "though the lesson about careful attention to duty remains valuable." Margaret had approached with additional cleaning materials, her expression troubled. "Sera's normally so careful, Your Majesty. I've never seen her spill anything before." "Even the most careful servants occasionally make mistakes," Morgana said smoothly. "The important thing is ensuring such mistakes don't recur through appropriate guidance." There was something in her tone, a satisfaction poorly disguised as professional concern, that sent unpleasant chills down Kieran's spine. The way Sera remained kneeling, scrubbing industriously while keeping her head down, suggested experience with this type of guidance. "Rise, child," Kieran said gently. "Accidents happen to everyone." Sera looked up at him with something like gratitude, though her violet eyes still held traces of fear. When she stood, he noticed her favoring her right hand slightly, as if the hot wine had indeed caused some discomfort. "Your Majesty's kindness does you credit," Morgana observed, "though sometimes mercy must be tempered with justice to prevent larger problems from developing." Justice. An interesting word choice for a minor spillage that might well have been deliberately caused. "Shall we review Lord Hamilton's correspondence?" Morgana continued, clearly eager to redirect his attention away from kitchen matters. "Of course." Yet as they climbed the stairs toward his study, Kieran found himself thinking about the careful timing of Morgana's movement, the immediate nature of her criticism, and the practiced way Sera had responded to what appeared to be a familiar pattern of blame and submission. Perhaps it was time to observe household dynamics more carefully, particularly the relationship between his most trusted advisor and the violet-eyed servant who seemed to trigger such intense supervisory attention. Some accidents he was beginning to suspect might be less accidental than they appeared. Chapter 5. The pattern over the following week, Alpha King Kieran found himself paying closer attention to the subtle rhythms of castle life that he had previously taken for granted. His observations began casually, noting which servants appeared during formal occasions, how tasks were distributed, who supervised whom in the complex hierarchy that kept Ravenshollow functioning smoothly. What emerged was a pattern that troubled him more with each passing day. During morning audiences in the Great Hall, he watched interactions between Chancellor Morgana and various household staff. With most servants, she maintained professional courtesy, polite but distant, efficient in her instructions, neither particularly kind nor deliberately cruel. Standard behavior for someone managing a large household. With Sera, however, the dynamic shifted noticeably. The violet-eyed girl appeared frequently at Morgana's side during formal functions, carrying documents, managing correspondence, or performing other duties that brought her into regular contact with nobles and visiting dignitaries. Yet every interaction carried an undercurrent of tension that seemed disproportionate to the tasks involved. "The girl walks on eggshells," Lord Garrett observed during a private conversation in the armory, where they'd gone to inspect new weapons from Milanese smiths. "Always has, since Morgana took charge of household management. Not that it's any of my business, mind you." "Eggshells?" Kieran tested the balance of a finely crafted sword while considering the Castellan's words. "Careful-like. Always watching for reactions, always ready to apologize before she's even done anything wrong. Seen it before in battle, with soldiers who've served under particularly harsh commanders." Garrett selected his own blade for examination. "Creates effective discipline, though some might call it excessive." "And what would you call it?" The older man paused thoughtfully. "Depends on what it achieves, I suppose. The girl's certainly obedient, efficient in her duties, causes no trouble. If that was the goal, then it's been successful." That afternoon, Kieran positioned himself in the solar overlooking the main courtyard, ostensibly reviewing financial records while actually observing the activities below. From this elevated position, he could see servants going about their daily tasks, hauling water, tending gardens, maintaining equipment, carrying messages between buildings. Sera appeared regularly, often burdened with tasks that seemed beyond what one person should handle, carrying multiple heavy baskets, managing armloads of linens, hurrying between locations with obvious urgency. Other servants worked steadily but at reasonable paces. Sera moved as if pursued by invisible deadlines that demanded constant haste. More troubling was what happened when other staff members interacted with her. They offered help occasionally, but she consistently declined with hasty shakes of her head, as if accepting assistance would somehow compound her troubles. When mistakes occurred, a dropped item, a stumble under excessive weight, she immediately looked around with apparent fear, checking to see who might have witnessed her clumsiness. "Your Majesty appears uncommonly interested in courtyard activities." Chancellor Morgana's voice interrupted his observations. She had entered the solar silently, carrying the afternoon's correspondence. "Merely ensuring our household operates efficiently," he replied diplomatically. "The harvest season brings additional demands on everyone's efforts." "Indeed, though excessive attention to minor details sometimes distracts from larger responsibilities." She set documents on his desk with practiced precision. "The papal legate has requested an audience regarding the new cathedral's construction. Such matters deserve priority over routine domestic concerns." Naturally. Yet he continued watching the courtyard, where Sera had just dropped one of several packages she was carrying. Instead of simply retrieving the fallen item, she looked around frantically before quickly gathering everything and hurrying away, clearly distressed by the minor accident. "The girl seems overwhelmed by her duties," he observed casually. Morgana glanced briefly toward the window. "Sera requires challenging assignments to develop proper work habits. Idle hands breed troublesome thoughts, particularly among those with unfortunate backgrounds." Unfortunate backgrounds? The border conflicts left many orphans with unrealistic expectations about their circumstances. Steady labor helps establish appropriate perspectives about their actual stations. Her tone carried pedagogical certainty, as if explaining well-established principles of household management. "I see. And what were her particular misconceptions?" "Nothing worthy of detailed discussion, Your Majesty. Childhood fantasies about importance and privilege that required correction through consistent demonstration of reality." Morgana moved to organize papers, clearly considering the subject closed. "Shall we review the legate's proposals?" But Kieran found himself less easily redirected than before. "Has she shown improvement under your guidance?" "Considerable progress, though certain attitudes require ongoing vigilance. Pride proves remarkably persistent, even when circumstances clearly demonstrate its inappropriateness." There was satisfaction in Morgana's voice, the tone of someone discussing successful training of a difficult animal. "Pride," he repeated thoughtfully. "False dignity that prevents proper humility and gratitude. The most challenging aspect of managing charity cases They often fail to appreciate the generosity extended by their betters. She paused, studying his expression. Your Majesty's concern for such matters reflects admirable Christian charity, though perhaps detailed oversight might prove unnecessary given more pressing demands on royal attention. The suggestion was diplomatically phrased, but its meaning was clear. Stop asking questions about household management. Coming from anyone else, such presumption would have been immediately corrected. From Morgana, whose competence and loyalty had proven invaluable, it represented advice worth considering. Yet something about the entire conversation reinforced his growing suspicion that Sera's situation involved more than simple servant discipline. The fear he'd observed, the excessive workload, the careful way other staff avoided involvement in her difficulties, all suggested a pattern of treatment that went beyond normal administrative oversight. You're quite right about pressing demands, he agreed aloud, though ensuring the welfare of all household members remains part of royal responsibility. Of course, Your Majesty. Rest assured that every individual receives exactly the attention their circumstances merit. The attention their circumstances merit? Another interesting choice of words from someone whose vocabulary was usually more precise. As they turned to papal correspondence, Kieran filed away his observations while planning more systematic investigation into household dynamics that apparently deserved closer scrutiny than he'd previously provided. Chapter 6. The Glimpse. The morning after St. Crispin's Day brought unseasonable warmth that transformed Ravenshollow's halls from their usual autumn chill into something approaching comfortable. Alpha King Kieran made his way to the chapel for morning prayers, following a route that took him through lesser-used corridors where servants often worked without awareness of royal presence. It was in one such passage, lined with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, that he encountered Sera carrying what appeared to be fresh linens for guest chambers. She was alone, moving with her characteristic efficient grace, when the heavy bundle shifted unexpectedly in her arms. As she adjusted her grip to prevent dropping the load, her right sleeve pulled back, revealing her forearm in clear morning light. What Kieran saw made him stop walking entirely. The skin of her arm bore a series of small, round scars, perfectly circular marks that could only have come from deliberate burning. They were old enough to have healed completely, faded to silvery white against her pale skin, but unmistakably intentional in their placement and uniformity. No accident could have created such precise, repeated patterns. Sera noticed his presence and immediately tugged her sleeve down, color draining from her face as she realized what he might have seen. She curtsied deeply, clutching the linens against her chest. Your Majesty, forgive me, I didn't hear your approach. There's nothing to forgive. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, carefully controlled despite the rage building in his chest. Those linens appear quite heavy. Perhaps someone should assist you with such burdens. Oh no, Your Majesty. I can manage perfectly well. Chancellor Morgana has trained me to handle all assigned duties independently. The words came quickly, defensively, as if accepting help would somehow constitute failure or rebellion. Chancellor Morgana trained you. The phrasing struck him as odd. Trained you in what, specifically? Sera's violet eyes darted nervously toward the nearest exit. Proper service, Your Majesty. How to complete tasks efficiently without bothering others. How to maintain appropriate gratitude for the sanctuary provided by your generosity. The response sounded rehearsed, like catechism recited after extensive practice, every word chosen carefully to deflect inquiry while demonstrating proper submission. Yet beneath the submissive exterior, he sensed intelligence analyzing his questions, trying to determine safe responses. And this training involved? He gestured vaguely toward her concealed arm. I'm very clumsy, Your Majesty. The lie came smoothly, well practiced. Accidents happen frequently when one lacks proper coordination. Chancellor Morgana has been most patient in teaching me greater care around dangerous items. Accidents. Multiple, perfectly circular accidents that left identical scars in neat rows along her forearm. The explanation was patently absurd, yet delivered with such conviction that he almost admired her ability to maintain the fiction. I see. And how long has this training in coordination been necessary? Since I began serving as Chancellor Morgana's assistant, Your Majesty. She identified my deficiencies immediately and has worked tirelessly to correct them. Again, the careful words that praised her tormentor while accepting responsibility for systematic abuse. Your deficiencies, he repeated, studying her face. Despite the submissive posture and practiced responses, her eyes held depths that suggested far more intelligence and awareness than she displayed. Someone had trained her very carefully in presenting herself as simple-minded and grateful, but the training hadn't quite succeeded in concealing her true nature. Yes, Your Majesty. Pride, clumsiness, inappropriate thoughts about my station. Chancellor Morgana has been most diligent in helping me overcome such character flaws. The catalogue of supposed failings sounded like a confession extracted through methodical pressure rather than genuine self-assessment. Each item was carefully crafted to justify whatever treatment had been inflicted while absolving the perpetrator of any wrongdoing. And you're grateful for such assistance? For just a moment, something flickered in her expression. Pain, perhaps, or barely suppressed anger. But it disappeared so quickly he might have imagined it. Most grateful, Your Majesty. Without Chancellor Morgana's guidance, I would never have learned to serve properly or appreciate the true generosity of those above my station. The words were perfect, exactly what any superior would want to hear from a properly managed subordinate. Yet they rang as false as cathedral bells made of tin, beautiful in form but hollow in substance. Well, he said finally, I'm pleased to hear of such success, education, though perhaps you should have those linens delivered before they become too heavy to manage. Of course, Your Majesty. Thank you for your kindness in speaking with someone so far beneath your notice. Even her gratitude was perfectly calculated, reinforcing her supposed insignificance while praising his condescension. Every element of the conversation had been designed to discourage further inquiry while demonstrating her complete acceptance of whatever treatment she received. As she hurried away, clutching the linens and keeping her sleeves carefully positioned, Kieran remained standing in the corridor processing what he'd witnessed. The scars alone were damning evidence, but more disturbing was the sophisticated psychological conditioning that had taught her to protect her abuser while accepting blame for her own victimization. This went far beyond harsh household discipline. What he'd glimpsed suggested systematic torture disguised as training, conducted with sufficient skill to ensure the victim's silence and cooperation. The question was no longer whether abuse was occurring, but how extensive it had become, and who else might be aware of the truth. His morning prayers would include specific petitions for guidance in addressing evil that had taken root within his own household, hidden behind masks of competence and justified through perverted interpretations of Christian duty. Some truths, once glimpsed, demanded action regardless of political consequences or personal discomfort. The circular scars on Sera's arm had revealed a reality that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. Chapter 7. The Investigation Alpha King. Kieran spent the remainder of that day wrestling with the implications of what he'd discovered, his mind turning over possible courses of action while attending to routine royal duties that suddenly seemed trivial compared to the systematic abuse occurring within his own household. By evening, he had reached a decision that required considerable discretion and careful planning. The next morning, he made his way to the kitchens during the quiet hours before dawn, when only essential staff would be preparing for the day's meals. Head cook Margaret was already at work, kneading dough for the morning bread, her movements efficient despite her advancing years. Your Majesty. She nearly dropped her mixing bowl in surprise. I wasn't expecting, that is, had I known you would be visiting. Please continue your work, he said gently, settling onto a stool near her workstation. I've come seeking conversation, not ceremony. Margaret's weathered face showed puzzlement but also pleasure at this unexpected royal attention. She resumed kneading while stealing glances at him, clearly uncertain about proper protocol for such an unusual situation. I've been reflecting on household management, Kieran began carefully, particularly regarding the welfare of staff members who came to us as refugees from the border conflicts. Ah, yes, Your Majesty. So many poor souls with nowhere else to turn. Christian charity demands we offer shelter, though some adjust better than others to their new circumstances. Indeed. The girl Sera, for instance. She's been here several years now, I believe. Margaret's hands stilled momentarily in their kneading. Nearly 7 years, Your Majesty. Found her half dead in the kitchen gardens, poor lamb. Grief and hunger had nearly finished what those murderous raiders started. Raiders? Terrible business, that. The whole settlement burned to nothing. Families slaughtered like sheep. She was the only survivor, wandering for days before collapsing near our walls. Margaret's voice carried genuine sorrow. Broke my heart, seeing such a young thing so damaged by evil men's cruelty. You said she was damaged. In what way? The cook glanced around nervously, as if checking for unwanted listeners. Couldn't speak for months, Your Majesty. Just stared with those violet eyes like she'd seen into hell itself. When words finally came, they were whispers about terrible things. Her father cut down defending their home, her mother's last screams as flames took her. A child's mind wasn't made to hold such horrors. Kieran felt his chest tighten with grief for sufferings that had shaped Sera's early years. Yet she recovered enough to serve in the household. Eventually, yes. It took years of gentle care, but she learned to speak properly, to work with her hands, to find some peace in daily tasks. Margaret's expression darkened. Though peace became scarcer after she was reassigned to serve Chancellor Morgana directly. How so? Margaret resumed her kneading with increased vigor, clearly agitated by the subject. Not my place to criticize, Your Majesty. Chancellor Morgana maintains high standards, expects perfection from those under her supervision. Some adapt well to such demands. And others? Others? She paused, choosing words carefully. Others perhaps require more patience than they receive. But it's not for simple cooks to question the methods of their betters. The careful phrasing told Kieran that Margaret had opinions she dared not express directly. Yet you've observed Sera's situation closely over the years. Has her service under Chancellor Morgana been beneficial? She's become very quiet again, Your Majesty. Not like the healing quiet we saw when she first arrived. That was peace finding its way back into a wounded soul. This is different. Watchful quiet, like someone expecting the next blow to fall. The next blow? Margaret's hand stilled entirely, and she looked directly at him with troubled eyes. Your Majesty, I'm just an old woman who cooks and tries to show Christian kindness to those in need. I don't understand the complexities of managing important households or training servants in proper behavior, but you understand human suffering. Yes, she whispered. I understand that. Then speak plainly. What have you observed? Margaret was quiet for so long that he wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Injuries that don't match the accidents claimed to cause them. Burns in places where kitchen mishaps wouldn't reach. Bruises hidden under sleeves and high necklines. Weight loss despite access to adequate food. And the fear, Your Majesty? Constant fear that turns a gentle girl into someone who jumps at shadows and apologizes for breathing. The catalog of observations painted a picture that matched his own growing suspicions. Have you spoken to anyone about these concerns? Once, Margaret said quietly. Went to guard Captain Morris, thinking perhaps he might investigate discreetly. He listened, seemed troubled, said he'd look into the matter. And? Found dead in his quarters 2 days later. Natural causes, according to the official report, though he'd been healthy as a horse just days before. She met his eyes directly. Message received, Your Majesty. Some questions are too dangerous to ask. Kieran felt ice form in his stomach as the full scope of the situation became clear. Not only was abuse occurring, but it was being protected through intimidation and possibly murder. The corruption had deeper roots than he'd imagined. "Margaret," he said seriously, "if you were to observe further evidence of improper treatment, would you be willing to document such observations, carefully, quietly, but thoroughly? For what purpose, Your Majesty?" "For justice, and to ensure that no one else suffers as Sera has suffered." Margaret studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The girl deserves better than what she's received. If Your Majesty believes something can be done to help her." "I believe that evil hidden in darkness withers when exposed to light. But such exposure requires evidence that cannot be dismissed or explained away." "Then yes, Your Majesty, I'll watch, I'll remember, and I'll record what I see. Though we must both be very careful. There are forces in this castle that will kill to protect their secrets." As he left the kitchens with Margaret's promise of assistance, Kieran realized he was embarking on an investigation that could reshape not only Sera's life, but the fundamental structures of power within his own court. The question was whether he possessed sufficient courage and wisdom to see it through to its conclusion, regardless of what truths emerged from the shadows. Chapter 8. The Fear. 3 days after his conversation with Margaret, Alpha King Kieran implemented a plan to observe Chancellor Morgana's interactions with Sera more directly. He arranged for private meetings in various locations throughout the castle, timing them to coincide with periods when Morgana would be managing household duties that required Sera's assistance. His first opportunity came during afternoon audiences with minor petitioners, sessions held in the smaller throne room, where Morgana typically organized documents while he heard requests for royal intervention in local disputes. The proceedings required her presence, but allowed for observation of how she conducted simultaneous administrative duties. Sera appeared midway through the session, carrying correspondence that required Morgana's attention. Kieran continued listening to a merchant's complaint about toll road assessments, while watching the interaction between Chancellor and servant from his peripheral vision. "The sealed letters from Canterbury," Morgana said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach Kieran's ears. "Where are they?" "I placed them with the morning correspondence, my lady, according to your instructions. My instructions were to separate ecclesiastical matters from secular business. Are you suggesting I failed to communicate clearly?" "No, my lady. I must have misunderstood." "Misunderstood, or simply failed to listen properly." Morgana's tone remained conversational, but something in her inflection made Sera step backward slightly. "How many times must we review the importance of careful attention to details?" "Forgive me, my lady. I'll retrieve the letters immediately and place them correctly." "You will retrieve them, yes. But first, explain why simple instructions continue to challenge someone who has received years of patient training." Kieran noted how Sera's breathing became shallow, her hands clasping together as if to prevent trembling. The fear in her posture was unmistakable, not simple embarrassment at making an error, but genuine terror at the consequences of displeasing her superior. "I have no excuse, my lady. My attention was inadequate, and I accept full responsibility for failing to serve you properly." Adequate attention requires focused thought, which requires proper mental discipline. Perhaps additional exercises in concentration would prove beneficial. The word exercises caused Sera to flinch almost imperceptibly. Whatever these exercises involved, they clearly represented punishment she dreaded. "Yes, my lady, whatever training you deem necessary to improve my service." "Indeed. We'll discuss appropriate measures this evening, when my other duties permit focused attention to your educational needs." Educational needs. The euphemism made Kieran's skin crawl, particularly given the obvious terror it inspired in Sera. When she departed to retrieve the misplaced letters, her movements carried the careful precision of someone expecting physical punishment for the slightest additional error. "Your Majesty?" The merchant was still speaking, apparently waiting for a royal response to his petition. "The toll assessments?" "Yes, of course. Lord Garrett will review your complaint and provide appropriate guidance." He dismissed the man with distracted courtesy, his attention still focused on the interaction he'd witnessed. "Household management requires constant vigilance. Morgana observed, apparently sensing his interest. Some individuals need more intensive guidance than others to maintain proper standards. The girl seemed genuinely distressed by her error. Appropriate reaction to inadequate performance, distress motivates improvement, while excessive comfort breeds carelessness. Her tone carried pedagogical certainty, as if reciting established principles of servant management. Yet she appeared to fear more than simple correction. Fear of disappointing those who have invested time and effort in her development. Healthy concern that encourages careful attention to duties. Morgana organized papers while speaking, her movements efficient and controlled. Your Majesty's compassionate nature does you credit, though sometimes mercy must be balanced with justice to achieve lasting positive results. Justice. That word again, applied to circumstances that seemed to require no formal judgment. The casual way Morgana discussed punishment for minor errors suggested a systematic approach to maintaining control through intimidation, rather than genuine correction of mistakes. What form does such justice typically take? Nothing dramatic, Your Majesty. Additional training exercises, extra duties to reinforce proper habits, temporary restrictions on privileges until improvement becomes evident. She paused, studying his expression. All conducted with Christian charity and focused on genuine betterment rather than mere punishment. The description sounded reasonable enough, yet failed to explain the level of fear he'd observed in Sera's behavior. Extra duties and training exercises shouldn't inspire the kind of terror that made someone's hands shake at the mention of evening consequences. I see. And these methods have proven effective? Remarkably so. Sera's current level of obedience and efficiency represents significant improvement over her initial condition. The transformation demonstrates what patient, consistent guidance can achieve even with the most challenging cases. Challenging cases. Another interesting phrase that suggested Sera had somehow been categorized as particularly difficult to manage, justifying whatever special attention she received. Her initial condition being pride, defiance, unrealistic expectations about her circumstances and treatment, common problems among refugees who haven't learned proper humility. Systematic correction of such attitudes becomes necessary for their own welfare and the smooth functioning of the household. The clinical way Morgana discussed breaking someone's spirit disturbed Kieran more than open cruelty would have. At least honest brutality could be recognized and condemned. This psychological manipulation was camouflaged behind claims of charitable education and Christian duty. And you've found systematic correction to be necessary in her case? Absolutely essential, Your Majesty. Without proper guidance, individuals like Sera tend toward behaviors that ultimately harm both themselves and those around them. Early intervention prevents larger problems from developing. Early intervention. The euphemisms continued, each one designed to make systematic abuse sound like wise management and preventive care. As the afternoon proceeded with routine petitions and administrative duties, Kieran found himself increasingly troubled by the gap between Morgana's rational explanations and the emotional reality he'd witnessed in Sera's terrified reactions. Someone was lying. Either Morgana was concealing the true nature of her methods, or Sera was performing elaborate deceptions to gain sympathy for treatment she deserved. Given the evidence of his own observations, he was beginning to suspect which interpretation was correct. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. That evening, Alpha King Kieran made a decision that would irrevocably alter his understanding of the situation developing within his household. Rather than retiring to his chambers after the evening meal, he chose to walk the castle corridors, ostensibly checking security arrangements but actually hoping to observe whatever educational exercises Morgana had promised to conduct with Sera. The castle settled into its nighttime rhythm as servants completed final tasks and nobles retreated to their private quarters. Kieran moved quietly through passages he rarely visited, following instincts that led him toward the tower where administrative offices were located, including Chancellor Morgana's private chambers. Light emanated from beneath her door, accompanied by voices too low to distinguish words. but carrying tones that made him approach more carefully. Positioning himself near a recessed alcove that offered concealment while allowing partial view through the keyhole, he prepared to witness whatever consequences Sera faced for her afternoon's supposed failure. What he observed through the narrow opening made his blood freeze in his veins. Sera knelt on the stone floor in the center of the chamber, her hands positioned behind her back in a posture of submission. Her plain gray dress had been removed, leaving her clothed only in a thin shift that revealed the true extent of damage that had been inflicted over years of systematic abuse. Her back was covered with scars, some old and silvered, others more recent and still pink with healing. Parallel lines that could only have come from whips, circular marks from deliberate burning, bruises in various stages of recovery that spoke of regular, methodical violence disguised as correction and training. But the physical evidence, horrifying as it was, paled beside the psychological conditioning on display. Sera remained perfectly still, despite obvious pain and fear, her posture demonstrating years of training in accepting whatever treatment was deemed appropriate. She neither struggled nor pleaded, simply waited with resigned acceptance for punishment to begin. Morgana moved around her with predatory grace, carrying a thin rod that glowed red-hot from the chamber's fireplace. Her beautiful features had transformed into something cold and calculating, revealing the monster that hid behind public facades of Christian charity and administrative competence. Tonight's lesson addresses the importance of careful attention to instructions, Morgana said conversationally, as if discussing academic curriculum rather than torture. Can you recite the principle we've discussed regarding your responsibilities? My sole purpose is to serve those above my station with perfect obedience and gratitude, Sera whispered, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Any failure to meet expectations reflects ingratitude that requires correction. Excellent. And what do you deserve when your service proves inadequate? Whatever punishment you deem necessary to improve my character and demonstrate proper respect for your generosity. The catechism was perfectly delivered, each word precisely articulated despite the trembling that had begun in Sera's hands. Years of training had taught her to participate in her own destruction while expressing gratitude for the privilege. Indeed, tonight's correction will help you remember the importance of accurate filing procedures. Present your left shoulder. Sera shifted slightly, exposing the area Morgana had specified. The action was performed without hesitation or protest, mechanical compliance that spoke of countless previous sessions conducted according to established ritual. Kieran had seen enough. The time for observation and careful planning had ended. Immediate intervention was required regardless of political consequences or personal cost. He pushed open the chamber door with sufficient force to announce his presence while maintaining enough control to avoid appearing unhinged. Both women turned toward him. Sera with horror at being discovered in such circumstances, Morgana with surprise that quickly transformed into a calculating assessment of how to manage this unexpected complication. Your Majesty, Morgana said smoothly, lowering the heated rod while maintaining perfect composure. I wasn't expecting... Clearly. His voice carried Arctic authority that froze whatever explanation she might have offered. Step away from her. Now. Your Majesty, I fear appearances may be misleading. Sera requires intensive correction for this afternoon's failures, and sometimes charitable guidance must seem harsh to achieve lasting beneficial... Step away from her, or I will personally demonstrate what harsh correction actually looks like. The threat was delivered with sufficient conviction that Morgana immediately moved toward the far side of the chamber, though her expression suggested rapid calculation of possible responses to this crisis. Kieran approached Sera, who remained kneeling in position of submission, apparently unsure whether new authority superseded old conditioning. Her violet eyes held confusion and terror, as if rescue represented a concept too dangerous to believe. Stand, he said gently. You're safe now. Your Majesty, she whispered, please don't interfere. Chancellor Morgana is only trying to help me overcome my deficiencies. Any punishment I receive is deserved and necessary for... Stop, The word carried enough authority to interrupt her rehearsed justifications. You will say nothing more until we've left this chamber and you've had time to remember that you owe allegiance to your king, not to someone who tortures you for entertainment. He removed his cloak and draped it around her shoulders, covering the evidence of systematic abuse while providing protection from further humiliation. Her flinch at the unexpected kindness broke something inside his chest that he hadn't realized was vulnerable. "Morgana," he said without turning toward his former chancellor, "you will remain in this chamber until I decide what justice requires for someone who has perverted every principle of Christian charity while hiding behind claims of educational necessity. Your Majesty, surely you understand that maintaining household discipline requires—" "What it requires," he interrupted, "is correction of the individual who has transformed my castle into a place where torture is called training, and systematic abuse is disguised as charitable guidance." As he guided Sera from the chamber, one arm supporting her trembling form while the other maintained protective positioning, Kieran realized that everything he had believed about his household, his administrator, and his own fitness as a ruler had just been revealed as comfortable lies that enabled unconscionable evil. The reckoning that followed would reshape not only their individual lives, but the fundamental principles upon which his kingdom operated. Chapter 10. The Scope of Evil Alpha King. Kieran escorted Sera to his private chambers, the most secure location in the castle where she could receive medical attention while remaining under royal protection. The irony wasn't lost on him that the safest place for an abused servant was the king's own quarters, suggesting how thoroughly corruption had infiltrated his household's normal operations. He summoned the castle's physician while Sera sat in a chair beside the fireplace, his cloak still wrapped around her shoulders like armor against further harm. Her violet eyes remained unfocused, as if her mind had retreated to some internal sanctuary where the evening's revelations couldn't penetrate. "The physician will tend your injuries," he said gently, settling in a nearby chair where his presence might provide comfort without threatening her carefully maintained composure. "Nothing you say or do tonight will result in punishment. You have my word as your king. Your Majesty is too kind to someone who doesn't deserve such consideration." The response came automatically, programmed through years of conditioning that made accepting kindness feel like transgression. "You deserve far better treatment than you've received. The fault lies not with you, but with those who were entrusted with your welfare and betrayed that sacred responsibility." Sera looked at him with confusion, as if the concept of being wronged rather than deserving punishment represented foreign territory her mind couldn't safely explore. "Chancellor Morgana explained that my sufferings were necessary to correct character flaws that— Chancellor Morgana is a sadistic criminal who used your vulnerability to satisfy her own twisted appetites while convincing you that torture was education." His voice carried controlled fury at the psychological manipulation that had taught his subject to defend her abuser. "Nothing that was done to you was necessary, deserved, or acceptable. But I am clumsy and proud and ungrateful for the sanctuary provided by— You are none of those things. You're an intelligent, graceful, remarkably strong young woman who survived both the murder of her family and years of systematic abuse while maintaining her sanity and basic human dignity." He leaned forward, catching her gaze and holding it. "The person who convinced you otherwise did so to justify her own cruelty, not because her assessment was accurate." Dr. Edmund arrived with his medical supplies, bowing respectfully before approaching his unusual patient. "Your Majesty, how may I serve?" "This lady requires treatment for injuries sustained through deliberate cruelty. Document everything you find. Type, severity, approximate age of wounds. The evidence will be needed for formal proceedings." As the physician began his examination, Kieran stepped outside to summon head cook Margaret, whose assistance would be essential for understanding the full scope of abuse that had occurred under his unknowing authority. When she arrived, her face pale with anxiety, he explained the evening's discoveries while avoiding graphic details. "I knew it was bad, Your Majesty. But seeing her like this—" Margaret's voice broke as she glimpsed Sera's condition through the partially open door. That poor lamb has been suffering right under our noses, and we did nothing to help her. Because anyone who tried to help faced consequences that discouraged further intervention. Captain Morris's convenient death wasn't coincidental, was it? No, Your Majesty. Nor was young Thomas's disappearance, or Sister Catherine's sudden transfer to the plague hospice after she asked too many questions about Sera's frequent accidents. Margaret's hands twisted her apron as she recited the catalogue of silenced voices. How many good people lost their lives or livelihoods because they tried to do right by that girl? The scope of Morgana's protective measures suggested planning and resources that went far beyond simple household management. Eliminating witnesses required connections, authority, and ruthless efficiency that spoke of corruption extending into multiple areas of castle operations. Who else knew about this situation? Hard to say for certain, Your Majesty. Some folks avoided noticing because they were afraid of what knowledge might cost them. Others might have been involved directly. Guards who looked the other way, servants who helped cover up evidence, officials who falsified reports about accidents and natural deaths. A conspiracy of silence maintained through terror. Yes, Your Majesty. And it worked perfectly until tonight. Dr. Edmund emerged from the chambers, his expression grim. Your Majesty, the injuries are extensive and systematic. Burns, lacerations, blunt force trauma, all inflicted with considerable skill to cause maximum pain while avoiding permanent disability or obvious external markings. This represents years of methodical torture conducted by someone with detailed knowledge of human anatomy. How many years? Based on scar progression and healing patterns, I'd estimate the abuse began approximately 4 to 5 years ago and continued regularly until very recently. The psychological conditioning appears even more comprehensive than the physical damage. 4 to 5 years, nearly the entire duration of Morgana's tenure as Chancellor, beginning shortly after she'd gained sufficient authority and confidence to pursue her sadistic interests without fear of discovery. Can she recover? Physically, yes, given proper care and protection from further harm. Psychologically, the doctor paused thoughtfully. Time will tell. The mind's ability to heal from such comprehensive trauma varies greatly between individuals. Much depends on whether she can learn to trust that safety is permanent rather than temporary. As Margaret went to sit with Sera, offering the maternal comfort that had been absent from the girl's life for far too long, Kieran contemplated the challenges ahead. Morgana would need to face justice, but her trial would expose the extent of his own failure as a ruler who had allowed such evil to flourish under his authority. More immediately, Sera would need intensive care and protection while recovering from years of systematic destruction. The process would require patience, resources, and absolute commitment to ensuring that her suffering finally ended, rather than simply changing forms. But first, he needed to secure evidence that would ensure Morgana faced appropriate consequences for her crimes, regardless of whatever political connections or hidden resources she might deploy in her own defense. The reckoning was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Chapter 11. The Resistance. Alpha King. Kieran's confrontation with Chancellor Morgana that night did not end with her meek acceptance of exposure and arrest. When he returned to her chambers with guards to formalize her detention, he found them empty except for a sealed letter bearing his name in Morgana's precise script. The message was brief but chilling in its implications. Your Majesty's interference in necessary household discipline demonstrates concerning judgment that requires careful consideration by those who truly serve the realm's interests. The girl's wild accusations of mistreatment reflect mental instability, common among charity cases seeking undeserved attention. Perhaps time for reflection will restore proper perspective on the difference between Christian charity and sentimental weakness that undermines effective governance. The letter concluded with information that made Kieran's blood run cold. Morgana had not acted alone, and her removal would trigger responses from allies positioned throughout his court and administration. Officials he had trusted, guards he depended upon, advisors whose counsel shaped kingdom policy, All were implied to be part of a network that viewed his protection of Sera as evidence of unfitness to rule. "She's vanished completely, Your Majesty," reported Captain Bradford, the guard commander who had replaced Morris after his suspicious death. "No trace in her chambers, stables show no missing horses, gates report no departures. Either she's hidden somewhere within the castle walls, or she had assistance in leaving undetected." Assistance suggests accomplices. Kieran studied the letter again, noting details that revealed planning and preparation. "How many of our people might be compromised?" "Unknown, sir. Chancellor Morgana had access to personnel files, financial records, and confidential information about every member of the household. Anyone with secrets worth protecting could have been coerced into cooperation." The scope of potential corruption was staggering. Morgana's position had provided opportunities to gather compromising information about virtually everyone in positions of authority, creating a web of blackmail and mutual dependence that could persist long after her physical departure. "Double security around Sera," Kieran commanded. "No one approaches her without my explicit permission. Triple the watch on castle entrances. If Morgana is still here, I want her found. If she's fled, I want to know how and where." But even as he issued orders, Kieran realized that the immediate physical threat was only part of a larger problem. Morgana's letter had implied that powerful figures viewed his protection of an abused servant as weakness rather than justice, suggesting political opposition that could threaten his ability to rule effectively. The next morning brought evidence that these threats were more than mere bluster. Lord Harrison, one of his senior advisors, requested an urgent audience regarding disturbing reports about recent events that require careful consideration by those committed to maintaining kingdom stability. "Your Majesty," Harrison began with diplomatic formality that barely concealed underlying criticism, "word has spread throughout the court regarding last evening's incident. Many express concern about implications for royal judgment and priorities." "Which implications concern them?" "The dramatic nature of intervention in routine household discipline, the elevation of servant complaints above administrative authority, the apparent willingness to destroy reputations based on unsubstantiated accusations from questionable sources." Harrison's tone suggested these concerns were shared by significant numbers of courtiers. "Unsubstantiated accusations?" "Your Majesty, Chancellor Morgana has served faithfully for years, earning universal respect for her competence and dedication. The servant girl, while deserving of Christian charity, represents exactly the sort of unstable individual whose word cannot be trusted regarding serious allegations." The casual dismissal of Sera's testimony revealed how deeply Morgana's version of events had been accepted by those who found it convenient to believe that abuse was merely discipline, and torture was simply firm guidance. Have any of these concerned courtiers examined the physical evidence of systematic torture? "Physical evidence can be misleading, Your Majesty. Servants suffer many accidents during their duties, and some individuals are prone to self-injury when seeking attention or attempting to escape legitimate consequences for poor behavior." The sophistication of the defense disturbed Kieran more than simple denial would have. Morgana and her allies had prepared comprehensive justifications that transformed documented evidence into questionable interpretation, victim testimony into manipulation, and royal intervention into overreaction. And what do these concerned parties suggest should be done? A thorough investigation by neutral parties, examination of all evidence by qualified experts, careful consideration of whether recent decisions serve the kingdom's best interests. Harrison paused meaningfully. Some question whether emotional attachment to a servant's welfare might compromise the objective judgment required for effective rule. Emotional attachment. The phrase was carefully chosen to suggest that his response was motivated by inappropriate personal feelings rather than moral obligation to protect the innocent. If that narrative gained acceptance, every decision he made could be questioned as evidence of compromised judgment. "I see. And if this investigation concludes that Chancellor Morgana's methods were appropriate, then proper order would be restored, inappropriate accusations would be addressed according to law, and governance could return to proven principles rather than sentimental innovations that threaten established stability." The threat was elegantly phrased but unmistakable. Recant his protection of Sera and restore Morgana's authority, or face organized political opposition that could undermine his ability to rule effectively. Tell the concerned parties that their investigation may proceed, Kieran said finally, but Sera remains under royal protection until objective evidence either confirms or refutes the charges against Chancellor Morgana. Of course, Your Majesty, though protection sometimes becomes indistinguishable from isolation when it prevents proper examination of relevant facts. As Harrison departed with his diplomatic threats and veiled ultimatums, Kieran realized that the battle for Sera's life had evolved into a struggle for the fundamental principles upon which his kingdom operated. The question was no longer simply whether one servant received justice, but whether power would continue to serve itself or accept accountability to those it was meant to protect. Chapter 12. The Allies. In the days following Chancellor Morgana's disappearance, Alpha King Kieran discovered that corruption had indeed spread throughout his administration, but so had resistance to that corruption from sources he hadn't expected. While some officials rallied to defend Morgana's methods and question royal judgment, others emerged from shadows with evidence they had been gathering secretly for years. The first surprise came from Sir Geoffrey, the youngest member of his personal guard, who approached with visible nervousness about violating chain of command. Your Majesty, I know it's not my place to speak without permission, but there are things you should know about what's been happening in areas where knights aren't usually allowed. Speak freely. Some of us have been keeping informal records, sir. Nothing official that might get people in trouble, but notes about things that didn't seem right. Geoffrey produced a leather portfolio from beneath his cloak. Servants with injuries that didn't match their explanations, people who disappeared after asking questions, orders that seemed designed to isolate certain individuals from potential help. The portfolio contained detailed observations spanning 3 years, documenting patterns that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse and intimidation. Multiple guards had contributed, creating a collective record that could corroborate Sera's testimony while demonstrating widespread awareness of problematic conditions. Why didn't you report these concerns through proper channels? We tried, sir. Captain Morris was investigating when he died so suddenly. After that, it became clear that proper channels led directly to people who were part of the problem rather than the solution. The next revelation came from an unexpected source. Lady Catherine, wife of Lord Harrison, who had delivered threats the previous day. She arrived at the castle in secret, using servants' entrances to avoid detection by her husband's allies. Your Majesty, I must speak quickly before my absence is discovered, she said urgently. There are things happening that go far beyond household management or even individual cruelty. What sort of things? Political maneuvering designed to create a crisis that would justify removing you from power. Chancellor Morgana has been gathering information and building alliances with the ultimate goal of installing a more manageable ruler who would serve certain interests rather than the kingdom's welfare. Lady Catherine's information revealed that Morgana's abuse of Sera was only one component of a larger conspiracy aimed at undermining royal authority through manufactured scandals and strategic blackmail. Documents she had copied from her husband's correspondence showed coordination with external enemies who sought to weaken the kingdom through internal division. Sera's suffering was never the primary goal, she explained. It was a means of testing how far they could push without triggering effective resistance. When you finally intervened, it provided the excuse they needed to question your fitness and begin moving toward more direct action. More direct action? Forced abdication in favor of someone who would serve their interests rather than oppose them. Your protection of a servant gave them the perfect opportunity to portray you as emotionally unstable and unfit for the responsibilities of kingship. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but so was the evidence that many people had been quietly working to resist it from within. Margaret the cook had allies among the kitchen staff who had been documenting suspicious activities. Stable masters had noticed irregular travel patterns that suggested secret meetings and coordination with external agents. Even some of the nobles who publicly supported Morgana privately expressed doubts about the direction of recent policies. "Your Majesty," Sir Geoffrey said as additional guards arrived with their own evidence, "we've been waiting for someone with authority to finally act. When you protected the girl and confronted the Chancellor, it gave us hope that resistance might actually be possible." Father Benedict, the castle chaplain, added his own perspective. "The systematic corruption of Christian charity into justification for cruelty represents heresy that threatens not only individual souls, but the moral foundation of Christian governance. Scripture demands protection of the innocent, not rationalization of their suffering." As evidence accumulated throughout the day, a clearer picture emerged of two competing networks within the castle, one dedicated to consolidating power through fear and intimidation, another committed to preserving principles of justice and mercy despite personal risk. Morgana's disappearance had forced both sides into the open, creating an opportunity for decisive action that might not come again. "What we need now," Sir Geoffrey observed, "is leadership that can unite resistance while dismantling the systems that enabled such corruption to flourish. And protection for those who testified against powerful people," Lady Catherine added. "Morgana's allies will try to eliminate witnesses and evidence before any formal proceedings can begin." Margaret nodded grimly. "That poor lamb Sera represents more than just one servant's suffering. She's become a symbol of whether justice can triumph over power, whether the innocent can find protection from those meant to serve rather than exploit them." As Kieran surveyed the assembled evidence and unexpected allies, he realized that the crisis had revealed both the depth of corruption within his court and the strength of opposition to that corruption among people he had underestimated. The question now was whether courage and principle could overcome entrenched power and systematic intimidation. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since discovering Sera's abuse, he felt that victory might be possible if he proved worthy of the trust these people had placed in his leadership. Chapter 13. The Stakes Rise. 3 days after Morgana's disappearance, Alpha King Kieran received disturbing intelligence that transformed the situation from internal political crisis to direct threat against the kingdom itself. Sir Geoffrey's network of loyal guards had intercepted communications revealing that external enemies were preparing to exploit the turmoil by launching coordinated attacks while the court remained divided and distracted. "Messages between Lord Harrison and Prince Marcus of Westmarch," Captain Bradford reported, spreading decoded correspondence across the council table. "They're planning to use the current instability as justification for foreign intervention to restore proper governance to a kingdom allegedly compromised by weak leadership." The letters detailed a sophisticated plan. External military pressure combined with internal political opposition would force Kieran's abdication in favor of a regency controlled by Morgana's allies. The conspiracy reached far beyond simple abuse of servants into treason that threatened the kingdom's independence. "How long before their forces can reach our borders?" 2 weeks at most, Your Majesty. Prince Marcus has been positioning troops for months under the pretense of border exercises. They only need justification to cross into our territory, which the current crisis provides. Sera's welfare, already a matter of personal conscience and royal duty, had become critical to national security. If Kieran could prove systematic abuse and expose the conspiracy, he might unite his nobles against foreign intervention. If Morgana's version of events prevailed, his own authority would crumble just as external enemies moved to exploit internal weakness. Where do we stand regarding internal support? Lady Catherine, whose intelligence proved invaluable despite the personal risk, provided updated assessments. Approximately 1/3 of the court remains firmly loyal to Your Majesty. Another third has been compromised through blackmail or promises of advancement under new leadership. The final third waits to see which side appears likely to triumph before committing themselves. The mathematics were sobering, but not hopeless, particularly given evidence that many who appeared to support Morgana did so from fear rather than conviction. If decisive action could break the conspiracy's power structure, neutral nobles might shift toward loyalty rather than expedience. What about military support? The Guard remains largely loyal, Sir Geoffrey reported, though some officers have divided allegiances based on family connections or personal debts to compromised nobles. However, rank-and-file soldiers respect actions more than political maneuvering. Your intervention to protect Sera has actually increased your standing among common guardsmen. This information provided hope, since ultimate authority rested on the consent of those who wielded weapons rather than those who manipulated words. If the army remained loyal, political opposition would lack means to enforce its will through violence. The afternoon brought another crisis that demonstrated how quickly events could escalate beyond control. Sera, who had been recovering under Margaret's care in secure quarters, suffered what Dr. Edmund diagnosed as a complete nervous collapse, brought on by learning that her testimony might determine the kingdom's fate. "She blames herself for everything that's happening," Margaret reported tearfully. "Keeps saying that if she'd just accepted her punishment quietly, none of this trouble would have developed. The poor child thinks she's responsible for bringing war and suffering to innocent people." Kieran found Sera curled in a corner of her chamber, trembling and repeating phrases that revealed how deeply Morgana's psychological conditioning had taken root. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Please don't let people die because of my selfishness." "Sera," he said gently, settling nearby without approaching too closely, "you are not responsible for other people's evil choices. The conspiracy existed long before your situation became known. You were their victim, not their cause. But if I hadn't complained, if I had been stronger, if you had been stronger, you would be dead." Morgana was escalating her abuse specifically because she knew discovery was becoming inevitable. Your survival required someone to intervene, which meant exposing corruption that threatened far more than one servant's welfare. The conversation continued for hours, Kieran patiently explaining how individual abuse connected to larger patterns of corruption, how personal courage could serve purposes beyond immediate self-protection, how justice sometimes demanded individuals to bear witness regardless of personal cost. "The people threatening our kingdom," he explained, "see you as proof that authority can be questioned and power can be held accountable. That's why they're so desperate to discredit your testimony and restore Morgana's version of reality. So I really am important to what happens." Your willingness to speak truth despite personal risk has become a symbol of whether justice can prevail over expedience. Not because you sought such responsibility, but because circumstances have made your individual suffering represent universal principles. That evening, as reports arrived of enemy troops massing at the borders and internal opponents organizing for final confrontation, Kieran realized that the next few days would determine not only Sera's future and his own authority, but whether the kingdom would survive as an independent realm governed by law rather than fear. The stakes could not be higher, and failure would cost far more than one servant's welfare or one king's crown. Everything they had built together, justice, mercy, protection of the innocent, hung in the balance as enemies both foreign and domestic prepared for decisive action. Chapter 14: The Betrayal. The trap was sprung on the 4th day after Morgana's disappearance, when Alpha King Kieran received urgent summons to address the full assembly of nobles regarding matters critical to kingdom security. What he found in the Great Hall was a carefully orchestrated confrontation designed to force his abdication or provide justification for his removal. Lord Harrison stood before the assembled court with documents that allegedly proved Kieran's unfitness to rule. "Your Majesty, we gather today with heavy hearts to address concerns that can no longer be ignored in the face of external threats requiring unity and decisive leadership." The hall was filled with nobles, whose expressions ranged from genuine concern to calculated ambition. Kieran noted which faces showed sympathy versus those that revealed predatory anticipation, filing away information about loyalties that this crisis had finally clarified. "Speak your concerns plainly. Intelligence reports indicate enemy forces preparing to exploit internal divisions for military advantage. Prince Marcus of Westmarch has formally demanded explanation for the persecution of respected administrators and elevation of servant accusations over noble testimony." Harrison's tone suggested these external concerns were reasonable, rather than manipulative. And you believe addressing these demands would serve the kingdom's interests? We believe that continued insistence on unsubstantiated charges against Chancellor Morgana provides enemies with justification for intervention that could otherwise be avoided through diplomatic resolution. Several nobles murmured agreement, though Kieran noticed that Sir Geoffrey and his allies remained silent, watching for opportunities to present contrary evidence. What diplomatic resolution do they propose? Restoration of proper administrative authority, appropriate consequences for false accusations that have damaged reputations and threatened stability, return to established principles of governance that prioritize kingdom welfare over individual sentiments. The demands were essentially complete capitulation, abandon Sera, restore Morgana, accept external pressure as legitimate, and govern according to principles that subordinated justice to expedience. And if I refuse? Lord Harrison exchanged glances with other conspirators before answering. Then loyal nobles may be forced to consider whether individual stubbornness should be allowed to threaten the welfare of thousands of innocent subjects. The threat was politely phrased but unmistakable. Submit or face removal through political means that would be presented as patriotic duty rather than treasonous rebellion. I see. Before responding to such ultimatums, perhaps the Assembly should examine evidence that places these demands in proper context. Kieran gestured to Sir Geoffrey, who approached with the portfolio of documentation they had assembled over recent days. But as the young knight reached the center of the hall, 3 guards moved to intercept him, guards whose loyalty had apparently been compromised through means Kieran hadn't anticipated. I'm afraid Sir Geoffrey has been relieved of duty pending investigation into charges of insubordination and conspiracy against legitimate authority, announced Captain Aldwyn, an officer whose appointment Morgana had recommended months earlier. The documents he carries were obtained through unauthorized surveillance that violated the privacy of respected nobles. The betrayal was perfectly timed and executed with precision that spoke of extensive preparation. Key witnesses had been neutralized, evidence was being discredited before presentation, and opposition was being framed as the real threat to kingdom security. On whose authority do you relieve royal guards of duty? On the authority of the Emergency Council established to address threats against kingdom stability, Lord Harrison replied smoothly. Powers granted by precedent when normal governance proves inadequate to current challenges. Emergency Council. Kieran realized that while he had been focused on gathering evidence and protecting Sera, his opponents had been implementing constitutional mechanisms that could legally justify his removal from power. And where is Chancellor Morgana during these proceedings that vindicate her methods? Regrettably, Chancellor Morgana was driven into exile by false accusations and threats of violence. However, she has provided testimony from safety that clarifies the true nature of recent events. A side door opened to admit a figure Kieran recognized with sick certainty. Sera, but not as he had last seen her. Gone was the broken, trembling victim of systematic abuse. Instead, she moved with confident grace, wearing fine clothes that emphasized her beauty while transforming her from servant into lady of apparent noble bearing. Your Majesty, she said with perfect courtesy, curtsying exactly as nobility would to their sovereign. I've come to apologize for the deception that has caused such unnecessary turmoil. The words struck him like physical blows. Everything he had witnessed, every injury he had documented, every moment of courage she had shown, all apparently performance designed to manipulate his sympathies for purposes he was only beginning to understand. You see, Lord Harrison continued with satisfaction that no longer required concealment. The girl's true identity and purposes tell a very different story than the one Your Majesty was led to believe. Perhaps she should explain personally how foreign agents recruited her assistance in destabilizing our kingdom through manufactured scandal. As Sera began speaking in cultured tones that revealed education far beyond what any refugee servant should possess, Kieran realized that his world was collapsing in ways he hadn't thought possible. Either everything he believed about justice and mercy was built on lies, or this final betrayal represented deception so sophisticated that reality itself had become unreliable. The trap was closing, and he wasn't certain anymore who were allies and who were enemies in a game where the rules themselves had been rewritten while he wasn't watching. Chapter 15. The Dark Night. The revelation of Sera's apparent deception struck Alpha King Kieran with devastating force that went beyond political humiliation to touch the very foundations of his understanding about good and evil, truth and lies, justice and mercy. Alone in his chambers after the Assembly's dramatic confrontation, he found himself questioning not only his judgment, but his fitness to rule a kingdom where even victims could be weapons wielded by sophisticated enemies. Lady Catherine, one of the few people he still trusted, had managed to visit briefly before the Emergency Council's new restrictions took effect. Her news provided context, but little comfort. "She's being coerced, Your Majesty. My sources in Harrison's household report that threats against Cook Margaret and other servants who helped her are being used to ensure compliance." Catherine's voice carried certainty despite the circumstances. The transformation in her speech and bearing proves education, yes, but not deception about the abuse she suffered. Yet she stands before the court claiming that abuse was performance rather than reality. Because refusing to do so would result in systematic elimination of everyone who showed her kindness. Morgana's people have made clear that cooperation saves lives while continued resistance ensures multiple deaths. The explanation was logical, but didn't diminish the crushing weight of watching someone he had tried to protect become an instrument of his own destruction. Every word Sera spoke in her new persona struck like personal betrayal, regardless of the coercion that motivated her performance. How could I have been so thoroughly deceived about the scope of the conspiracy? "You weren't deceived about corruption, Your Majesty. You simply underestimated how deeply it had penetrated and how sophisticated its methods had become." Catherine's expression showed sympathy for his crisis of confidence. Morgana's network spent years positioning people and gathering leverage. No one could have anticipated the full extent without access to information they carefully controlled. But Kieran's self-doubt ran deeper than strategic miscalculation. The events forced him to confront fundamental questions about his understanding of human nature and moral responsibility. If someone as apparently innocent as Sera could be transformed into a weapon against justice, what did that suggest about his ability to distinguish between good and evil? "Perhaps the Emergency Council is correct," he said quietly. "Perhaps emotional attachment to individual suffering has compromised my judgment about larger responsibilities." "Or perhaps," Catherine replied firmly, "your commitment to protecting the innocent is exactly what this kingdom needs, even when that commitment proves costly and complicated." She left him with reports from loyal guards about troop movements and political maneuvering, but the information felt abstract compared to the personal crisis consuming his thoughts. Outside his window, night had fallen over a castle where enemies had gained control while he struggled with questions that seemed to have no satisfactory answers. Dr. Edmund's medical testimony about Sera's injuries remained incontrovertible evidence of systematic torture, yet her current behavior suggested either complete psychological breakdown or elaborate deception spanning years. Both possibilities were disturbing in different ways. Either he had failed to protect someone whose suffering was genuine, or he had been manipulated by performance so sophisticated that expert medical examination couldn't detect it. The hours passed slowly as Kieran wrestled with doubt that threatened to paralyze his ability to make decisions of any kind. If his judgment could be so thoroughly compromised regarding someone he had observed closely, how could he trust his assessment of political situations, military threats, or administrative policies that affected thousands of lives? Near dawn, a soft knock interrupted his brooding. Margaret the cook entered with food he hadn't requested, and concern that transcended normal servant-master relationships. "Your Majesty, you mustn't let them destroy your faith in doing right by people who need protection." "Margaret, I've learned tonight that my understanding of who needs protection and who threatens the kingdom may be fundamentally flawed." "No, Your Majesty. You've learned that evil people will use any means necessary to maintain power, including forcing their victims to become accomplices. Her voice carried absolute certainty. "That girl is still the same broken child I found in the gardens years ago. What's different is how desperate her enemies have become." "How can you be certain?" "Because I've spent years watching her try to heal from wounds that kept being reopened by fresh cruelty. No one maintains that level of performance under that degree of genuine suffering. The girl who speaks against you now is protecting people she cares about at the cost of her own soul." Margaret's faith in Sera's essential nature provided some comfort, but couldn't resolve the larger crisis of authority that threatened everything he had tried to build. By tomorrow, enemy forces would likely cross the borders while internal opposition moved to complete his removal from power. The question was no longer whether he had been deceived, but whether he possessed sufficient courage and wisdom to continue fighting for principles that seemed to bring only destruction to those he sought to protect. Chapter 16. The revelation dawn brought unexpected salvation in the form of intelligence that transformed Alpha King Kieran's understanding of the crisis and restored his faith in both Sera's innocence and his own judgment. Sir Geoffrey, despite his supposed detention, had managed to infiltrate enemy communications through loyal guards who maintained access to sensitive areas, while appearing to serve the Emergency Council's interests. The young knight arrived at Kieran's chambers with documents that revealed the full scope of deception employed against them. "Your Majesty, we've intercepted correspondence between Lord Harrison and Prince Marcus that explains everything that's been happening." The letters detailed a sophisticated psychological operation designed to break both Kieran's will and Sera's spirit through manipulation so comprehensive that reality itself became suspect. Sera's transformation wasn't evidence of deception about her abuse, but proof of how thoroughly her enemies understood the leverage provided by threatening innocent people. "They've been holding Cook Margaret, Father Benedict, and 6 other servants in a secure location," Geoffrey explained, "with credible threats that any deviation from scripted behavior would result in their immediate execution. Sera isn't betraying you, Your Majesty. She's trying to save the only family she's ever known." Additional documents revealed that Morgana had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario, training Sera in noble speech and mannerisms while convincing her that such education was reward for good behavior rather than preparation for eventual use as a weapon. The systematic torture had served dual purposes, breaking her resistance while providing skills that could be deployed if discovery became unavoidable. "The medical evidence of abuse remains completely accurate," Geoffrey continued, "but they've convinced her that claiming it was performance rather than reality will save lives she values more than her own welfare." Relief flooded through Kieran like spring water after drought, not because his situation had improved, but because his faith in fundamental moral principles had been restored. Sera remained the innocent victim he had believed her to be. Her apparent betrayal represented heroic sacrifice rather than sophisticated deception. Where are the hostages being held? The old tower beyond the eastern wall, under guard by mercenaries hired specifically for this operation. The location was chosen to remain outside normal patrol routes while providing easy escape if rescue attempts were detected. Margaret appeared in the doorway with news that completed their understanding of enemy tactics. "Your Majesty, I've been allowed to speak with Sera briefly. She's near collapse from the strain of maintaining the performance while knowing she's destroying the one person who tried to help her." "What did she say?" "That she'd rather die than continue, but they've shown her detailed plans for torturing everyone she cares about if she fails to convince the court that her accusations were lies." Margaret's eyes blazed with fury at the psychological cruelty being inflicted. "They're using her love for others as chains to bind her to their service?" The revelation clarified what needed to be done. Rescue the hostages to free Sera from coercion, then present evidence of the conspiracy to nobles who might still be swayed by proof of systematic manipulation. Success would expose enemy methods while validating Kieran's protection of innocent people. Failure would complete his destruction while ensuring Sera's continued enslavement. "How many guards are at the tower?" 12 mercenaries, well-armed and positioned defensively. They've been told that any rescue attempt proves royal madness that justifies immediate elimination of hostages before retreating to report mission success to their employers. The tactical challenge was significant, but not impossible, particularly with an element of surprise and motivation provided by righteous fury at seeing love weaponized against the innocent. More importantly, action would provide escape from the paralysis of doubt that had consumed him throughout the night. "Gather every man whose loyalty remains unquestioned," Kieran commanded, feeling purpose return as strategy replaced uncertainty. "We move at noon, when enemy attention focuses on the afternoon assembly where they expect to finalize my removal. And afterward? Afterward, we present evidence that will force neutral nobles to choose between supporting justice or enabling treason. Some will still choose expedience over principle, but enough may be swayed to prevent foreign conquest from succeeding." As preparations began for what might be the most important military action of his reign, Kieran felt restored confidence in the principles that had motivated his initial intervention. Sera's heroic sacrifice to protect others proved that goodness could survive even comprehensive evil, though it might require rescue from those strong enough to fight for it. The girl who had sparked this crisis through her suffering remained worthy of protection, and the kingdom that had nurtured such corruption required cleansing that only courage and decisive action could provide. Chapter 17. The Rescue Alpha King. Kieran led 20 loyal guards through the forest paths that approached the old tower from directions that avoided normal sentry positions, moving with stealth learned during border campaigns against raiders who relied on surprise and swift withdrawal. The mission required perfect timing and coordination, since any delay would allow enemies to execute hostages before defenders could prevent it. Sir Geoffrey's intelligence had proven accurate regarding guard positions and defensive arrangements, but hadn't accounted for the psychological sophistication of their opponents' preparations. As they neared the tower, sounds of deliberate activity suggested that their approach had been detected despite careful precautions. "It's too obvious," Captain Bradford whispered, studying movement patterns that seemed designed to be observed rather than genuinely defensive. "They want us to see certain positions while concealing others. A trap? Likely. The question is whether we can spring it without losing the hostages they're using as bait." Kieran considered alternatives while watching guards who seemed more interested in being visible than maintaining actual security. The enemy's confidence suggested preparation that went beyond simple defensive positioning. They expected this rescue attempt and had planned accordingly. Different approach, he decided. Small team for the actual rescue, larger force to provide distraction and contain enemy response. If they're expecting direct assault, we give them something else to consider. The revised plan divided their force into 3 groups. Geoffrey would lead the rescue team through concealed approaches, while Bradford created an obvious diversion that drew attention away from the real objective. Kieran would coordinate both efforts while maintaining reserve force to exploit whatever opportunities developed. As Bradford's men began their noisy approach from the main road, enemy guards responded exactly as anticipated, consolidating to meet obvious threats while leaving alternative routes less heavily defended. Geoffrey's team slipped toward the tower's base through shadows that provided concealment from distracted sentries. But as they reached the entrance, sounds from within revealed complications that intelligence hadn't predicted. Voices carried through narrow windows, including one that made Kieran's blood freeze with recognition. Sera, speaking in desperate tones that suggested something had gone wrong with the carefully scripted performance. "Please, I've done everything you demanded. The hostages were supposed to remain safe as long as I cooperated. You promised—" "Promises change when circumstances require adaptation," replied a voice Kieran recognized as Morgana's, speaking with casual cruelty that suggested the psychological torture had escalated beyond even their previous expectations. "Your performance has been adequate, but no longer serves our purposes. Time for more. Permanent solutions." Through the window, Kieran glimpsed interior arrangements that revealed the full scope of enemy preparation. The hostages were secured in the tower's main chamber, but Sera was being held separately in conditions that suggested her usefulness was ending. Morgana's presence indicated this wasn't simply prisoner detention, but active interrogation designed to extract additional leverage. "New plan," he whispered to Geoffrey. "I go in alone to negotiate. They want dramatic confrontation, so we provide it. When their attention focuses on me, you extract the hostages while Bradford's diversion continues. Your Majesty, that's the only way to ensure innocent people survive what's coming. They'll accept my surrender in exchange for the hostages because it achieves their ultimate objective." Before Geoffrey could protest further, Kieran approached the tower's main entrance with obvious intent to negotiate rather than assault. His appearance triggered immediate response from guards who had clearly been anticipating exactly this development. "I've come to discuss terms," he called out, projecting voice to carry throughout the structure. "Exchange the hostages for my personal surrender, and no one needs to die today." Morgana appeared at an upper window, her beautiful features twisted into expressions of triumph that revealed how thoroughly she had planned for this moment. "Your Majesty, how noble of you to offer yourself for your subjects' welfare, though I fear the terms have evolved since morning." "What terms do you propose?" "Public confession that your judgment has been compromised by emotional attachment to unworthy objects, formal abdication in favor of regency that can restore proper governance, and acknowledgement that your intervention in household discipline represented madness requiring permanent correction. The demands were essentially complete humiliation, followed by whatever permanent solution they deemed appropriate for someone who had threatened their power structure. Yet agreeing might provide time for Geoffrey's rescue operation to succeed." "And if I agree?" "Then your death will be recorded as a natural consequence of madness, rather than execution for treason. History will remember a king who lost his mind over a servant girl rather than a ruler who was murdered for opposing necessary reforms." As negotiations continued with theatrical formality that served both sides' needs, Kieran heard subtle sounds that indicated Geoffrey's team was making progress toward the hostages. The question was whether he could maintain enemy attention long enough for extraction to succeed without triggering the violent response that would eliminate everyone they were trying to save. Time was running out, and success depended on perfect coordination between multiple moving parts in a game where failure meant death for innocent people, whose only crime had been showing kindness to those who needed protection. Chapter 18. The Feral Moment. The rescue operation proceeded with deadly precision until the moment Alpha King Kieran heard Sera's scream, not the controlled distress of someone performing fear, but the raw agony of someone being systematically destroyed. Through the tower's narrow windows, he glimpsed enough to understand that Morgana had grown tired of psychological manipulation and returned to the physical torture that provided more immediate satisfaction. What he saw through that window triggered something primal and unstoppable, as if years of civilized restraint simply evaporated before protective fury that exceeded rational thought. The king who had built his life on measured responses and diplomatic solutions disappeared, replaced by something far more dangerous than any enemy had anticipated. "Sir Geoffrey," his voice carried authority that made hardened warriors step backward, "extract the hostages. Now." "Your Majesty, the plan has changed." Steel sang as he drew his sword, the blade catching afternoon sunlight like captured fire. "Anyone who wishes to live should step aside." He approached the tower entrance with a purpose that transformed casual negotiation into declaration of war. The guards who moved to intercept him discovered that royal swordsmanship was more than ceremonial display when motivated by protective rage that recognized no limits or constraints. The first man fell before understanding that diplomatic hostage situations had evolved into lethal combat. The second managed to raise his weapon before discovering that technique meant nothing against fury that cut through defense like winter wind through autumn leaves. The third guard simply fled rather than face something that had transcended normal human limitations. Inside the tower, Kieran followed Sera's continued screams up narrow stairs worn smooth by centuries of use, each cry driving him deeper into the primitive state where justice simplified into immediate, personal, and final. Civilized law could wait. What was happening to her demanded more direct intervention. He found them in the upper chamber where Morgana had arranged the scene like some perverse theatrical performance. Sera was secured to a wooden frame, her back exposed to reveal the constellation of scars that told the story of years spent under systematic torture. Fresh wounds bled freely where Morgana had been adding new injuries to old, apparently for the pure pleasure of watching someone suffer. "Your Majesty," Morgana said with a smile that revealed anticipation rather than surprise at his arrival. "How perfect that you should witness the final lesson in appropriate treatment of those who threaten order through inappropriate accusations." She held a heated rod similar to the one he had seen months earlier, its tip glowing red-hot from the chamber's fireplace. Around Sera's feet lay instruments that spoke of torture, refined through years of practice and creativity, tools designed to cause maximum pain while avoiding immediate death. "I was just explaining to our troublesome servant," Morgana continued conversationally, "how her cooperation in recent theatrical performances has earned her the privilege of demonstrating what happens to those who persist in spreading lies about their betters." Sera's violet eyes met his across the chamber, and what he saw there completed his transformation from civilized ruler into something that operated according to much older laws. Pain, yes, but also recognition that he had come for her despite every rational calculation that argued against such action. Relief warred with terror, as she realized that rescue might cost him everything he had tried to protect. "Step away from her," he said quietly, though his voice carried undertones that made Morgana pause in her approach toward Sera's exposed back. "Or what, Your Majesty? You'll risk kingdom stability for one servant's welfare? You'll sacrifice innocent lives to save someone whose word cannot be trusted? You'll prove definitively that emotional weakness has rendered you unfit for the responsibilities of rule?" Each question was calculated to restore rational thought over primitive protectiveness, appealing to principles of duty and sacrifice that had governed his entire life. Under normal circumstances, such arguments might have succeeded in moderating his response. But normal circumstances had ended the moment he heard Sera scream, "I said step away from her!" What followed was not combat in any civilized sense, but systematic destruction of someone who had confused mercy with weakness and mistaken restraint for inability to act decisively when circumstances demanded it. Morgana's protests about royal dignity and political consequences were answered with steel that cut through sophisticated justifications like they were morning mist. When Sir Geoffrey reached the chamber with rescued hostages and loyal guards, he found his king methodically cutting Sera free from her restraints, while Morgana's body cooled on stones that would require extensive cleaning to remove evidence of what happened to those who tortured innocent people within reach of protective authority. "Your Majesty?" Geoffrey's voice carried uncertainty about whether the man before him was still the civilized ruler he had sworn to serve. "The Chancellor," Kieran replied without looking up from his careful work with the bonds that had held Sera, "has received appropriate correction for her educational methods." Margaret pushed past the guards to wrap Sera in cloak and motherly comfort, while Dr. Edmund began immediate assessment of fresh injuries that would require careful treatment. Only when his people were secure did Kieran turn attention to strategic considerations that had become secondary to more immediate concerns. "Status of enemy forces?" "Scattered, Your Majesty. Word of Morgana's death has reached Prince Marcus, who apparently decided that invasion without internal support would prove inadvisable. And internal opposition? Considerably less enthusiastic about supporting deceased leadership. Lord Harrison has requested an immediate audience to discuss terms for reconciliation." Kieran nodded, understanding that political maneuvering would resume once immediate threats had been resolved. But something fundamental had changed during those moments when civilization gave way to more primitive justice. He had learned that some principles were worth defending through any means necessary, regardless of political cost or diplomatic complexity. "Tell Lord Harrison that terms for reconciliation will be discussed after we've ensured that no other members of our household require rescue from systematic abuse disguised as proper discipline." The transformation was complete. From king who ruled through delegation and trust, to protector who would personally ensure that power served justice rather than enabling cruelty. The realm had gained a ruler who understood that true authority came from willingness to sacrifice everything for those who depended on royal protection. Chapter 19: Justice and Healing. In the weeks following Chancellor Morgana's death, Alpha King Kieran implemented systematic reforms that transformed not only the immediate crisis, but the fundamental structures that had enabled such corruption to flourish. The trials of her surviving conspirators became public demonstrations of accountability that served educational purposes beyond mere punishment. Lord Harrison, faced with overwhelming evidence of treason and foreign collaboration, chose cooperation over continued resistance. His testimony revealed the full scope of the conspiracy while implicating other nobles whose positions required careful investigation before appropriate consequences could be determined. The network extended far beyond what we initially suspected, Sir Geoffrey reported during one of their daily briefings. Systematic blackmail, coordinated intimidation, financial corruption. Morgana had built an organization that could have controlled the kingdom within another year if discovery had been delayed. And now? Dismantled, Your Majesty. The foreign connections have been severed, compromised officials have been removed or turned to serve legitimate authority, and new safeguards prevent similar corruption from developing undetected. But Kieran's primary concern remained focused on Sera's recovery from years of systematic trauma that had been compounded by the psychological warfare of recent weeks. Dr. Edmund's medical treatment addressed physical injuries, while Margaret provided maternal comfort that began healing deeper wounds that medicine couldn't reach. "She has nightmares," Margaret reported quietly, "but they're different now. Before, she dreamed about deserving punishment and disappointing people who had been kind to her. Now she dreams about being rescued, about finding safety, about people who care enough to fight for her welfare." The shift represented progress, though Dr. Edmund cautioned that recovery from such comprehensive trauma would require years rather than months. The mind protects itself through patterns that become habitual even after circumstances change. Learning to trust safety takes time, particularly when previous trust was systematically betrayed. Sera herself remained fragile but determined to contribute positively rather than simply accepting care without giving back. Her intelligence, revealed once fear no longer suppressed it, proved remarkable in ways that suggested noble birth despite the lack of documentation about her origins. "I remember things now," she told Kieran during one of their careful conversations, conducted always in Margaret's presence to avoid any suggestion of impropriety. "My father was Lord Edmund of Thornwick. My mother was Lady Catherine Thornwick. They were killed when I was 15 during raids that weren't random attacks but coordinated strikes against families who opposed certain political movements." The information provided context for her education and bearing while explaining why her survival had required complete concealment of her identity. Enemies who had killed her parents would have completed their work if her true heritage had been discovered. "That makes you Lady Sera of Thornwick," Kieran observed, "with legitimate claim to lands and titles that have been administered by regents since your family's supposed extinction." "I don't want titles or lands, Your Majesty. I want to help ensure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." Her voice carried conviction that impressed him with its strength despite recent trauma. "My experiences have taught me things about identifying abuse and protecting vulnerable people that could be valuable if properly applied." The suggestion led to the establishment of new royal positions dedicated to investigating complaints about treatment of servants, orphans, and others whose lack of power made them vulnerable to exploitation. Sera's unique combination of personal experience and noble education made her ideally suited to lead such efforts once her recovery progressed sufficiently. "The irony," Margaret observed, "is that everything Morgana tried to destroy in that child, her intelligence, her compassion, her strength, has become exactly what the kingdom needs to prevent such corruption from recurring." 3 months after the crisis, Sera stood before the court in robes that proclaimed her restored noble status, while she presented the first comprehensive report on systemic abuse within royal administration. Her findings led to additional reforms and demonstrated that survival could be transformed into service that honored both personal suffering and community welfare. Your Majesty, she concluded her presentation, I propose that every person employed in royal service receive training in recognizing signs of abuse, clear procedures for reporting concerns without fear of retaliation, and regular inspections by independent authorities whose sole responsibility is protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The proposals were approved unanimously by nobles who had witnessed the costs of ignoring systematic cruelty. More importantly, they established precedents that would outlast current personalities while creating systems designed to prevent power from being used to exploit vulnerability. As Kieran watched Sera address the court with confidence that honored her suffering while refusing to be defined by it, he reflected on how the crisis had revealed both the worst and best of human nature. Evil could flourish when good people remained silent, but courage and justice could triumph when someone proved willing to risk everything for principles that transcended personal comfort. The kingdom was stronger now, not despite the trauma it had endured, but because that trauma had forced recognition of truths that comfortable ignorance had previously concealed. Chapter 20: New Foundations. 6 months after the crisis that had nearly cost Alpha King Kieran his throne and Sera her life, the castle operated according to new principles that emphasized protection of the vulnerable over preservation of hierarchy for its own sake. The changes extended beyond simple policy reforms to encompass fundamental alterations in how power was exercised and monitored throughout the realm. Monthly inspections have identified and corrected 17 cases of servant abuse. Lady Sera reported during the council session that had replaced Chancellor Morgana's administrative monopoly with collaborative oversight involving multiple perspectives. Most were resolved through education and supervision, though 3 cases required removal of individuals whose behavior suggested deeper problems. Her transformation from tortured servant to respected administrator had been gradual but thorough, supported by careful attention to her recovery needs while allowing her to contribute meaningfully to preventing others from suffering similar abuse. The combination of personal experience and noble education made her uniquely qualified to identify problems that traditional oversight had missed. The educational programs for household staff have also proven successful, Sir Geoffrey added, his own role having evolved from guard captain to coordinator of security that prioritized protection over mere enforcement. Servants now understand their rights and responsibilities, while supervisors learn techniques for maintaining discipline without crossing into cruelty. Alpha King Kieran observed these developments with satisfaction that went beyond administrative efficiency to encompass deeper questions about the purpose of authority and the responsibilities of leadership. The crisis had taught him that true strength came from protecting those who depended on royal justice, rather than simply maintaining order through fear and intimidation. What of the broader reforms throughout the kingdom? Implementation proceeds steadily, Your Majesty, replied Lord Garrett, one of several nobles who had proven their loyalty during the conspiracy, while demonstrating competence that justified continued trust. Local administrators report initial resistance from some quarters, but most recognize that protecting vulnerable populations serves everyone's long-term interests. The resistance was expected, since systematic change always threatened those who benefited from existing inequalities. However, the evidence of what unchecked abuse could accomplish had persuaded most reasonable people that prevention was preferable to crisis management after problems became uncontainable. And external threats? Prince Marcus has withdrawn to lick his wounds and explained to his own nobles how foreign intervention failed so spectacularly, Captain Bradford reported with satisfaction. Other potential enemies have apparently decided that kingdoms with internal unity present poor targets for exploitation. The failed conspiracy had strengthened rather than weakened the realm's position, demonstrating to both subjects and enemies that genuine justice created more durable power than systematic oppression could achieve. Foreign powers seeking to exploit internal divisions found instead a more cohesive society that had learned valuable lessons about identifying and resisting corruption. But Kieran's primary satisfaction came from observing Sera's continued recovery and growing confidence in her ability to contribute positively to the society that had first failed and then protected her. The sessions with Dr. Edmund continued, but her nightmares were becoming less frequent while her capacity for normal relationships gradually expanded. "There's something else, Your Majesty," Sera said as the formal council session concluded and other members departed. "Something personal rather than administrative." Margaret, who had remained to provide her usual protective presence, smiled with understanding that suggested she knew what was coming. "I've been thinking about the future," Sera continued, color rising in her cheeks as she approached topics that would have been impossible to consider during her years of systematic abuse. "About what life might hold beyond simply surviving each day or serving institutional purposes. And what conclusions have you reached? That healing includes learning to want things for myself rather than simply accepting whatever others decide I deserve." She paused, gathering courage to speak directly about subjects that terrified her more than any physical threat. "I've learned to trust your kindness, to believe in your protection, to hope that the future might hold more than just safety from persecution." Margaret had begun gathering papers with obvious intent to provide privacy for conversations that required delicate handling, but Sera's next words stopped her in place. "I would like permission to court you, Your Majesty, not as a grateful servant seeking elevation, but as someone who has learned that love might be possible between people who have shared suffering and emerged stronger together." The request was phrased with formal courtesy that couldn't quite conceal underlying vulnerability. She was offering her heart while acknowledging that rejection would be perfectly reasonable given their different stations and the complications of their shared history. "The court would have opinions about such an arrangement," Kieran replied carefully, though his own feelings had been developing along similar lines despite efforts to suppress them as inappropriate. "Let them have opinions. We've learned that courage sometimes requires disregarding what others think proper in favor of what we know to be right." Her violet eyes met his directly. "If you could care for me as more than duty requires, then perhaps we could discover what happiness looks like when built on foundations stronger than political convenience." Margaret's delighted exclamation provided endorsement that carried more weight than any noble's approval, since she had witnessed their relationship develop from the beginning while understanding better than anyone what genuine healing looked like. "I would be honored," Kieran said simply, "to discover what love might become when given time to grow between people who have learned its true value through nearly losing everything they held dear." The courtship that followed would be careful, gradual, and conducted with attention to Sera's continued need for gentle treatment as she learned to trust emotions that abuse had taught her to suppress. But the possibility of happiness built on mutual respect and shared purpose provided hope that transcended any merely political arrangement. Chapter 21. Love and Leadership. The courtship between Alpha King Kieran and Lady Sera unfolded slowly over the following months, conducted with careful attention to her continuing recovery while allowing genuine affection to develop between two people who had learned to value trust above all other considerations. Their relationship became a model for how power could serve love rather than dominating or exploiting it. "She's becoming herself again," Margaret observed during one of their private conversations about Sera's progress. "Not the broken child I found in the gardens, but not the terrified victim of recent years either. Someone new, built from strength discovered through surviving experiences that would have destroyed weaker souls." The transformation was evident in countless small ways. Sera's increasing comfort with physical affection, her willingness to express opinions that differed from Kieran's, her growing confidence in social situations that had previously triggered anxiety. Most importantly, she was learning to want things for herself rather than simply accepting whatever others provided. "I think about the future now," she told him during one of their evening walks through gardens that had been expanded to include sections designed for private conversation. Real future, not just survival until tomorrow. Marriage, children, growing old together. Possibilities that used to seem like impossible dreams. "And what do those possibilities look like to you?" "Partnership," she said without hesitation. Not the traditional arrangement where wives submit to husbands' authority, but genuine collaboration between equals who happen to complement each other's strengths and weaknesses. The concept was radical for their time and station, yet made perfect sense given their shared experience of how corrupted authority could destroy innocent lives. Their relationship had begun with his protection of her vulnerability. Its continuation required mutual respect that recognized her strength rather than perpetuating dependence. The court will expect traditional roles, he warned, though his tone suggested that court expectations mattered less than their personal agreements about how to structure their life together. Then the court will need to adjust its expectations. I've learned too much about the costs of silence and submission to accept arrangements that require either. She paused, considering how to express thoughts that challenged conventional wisdom about marriage and authority. Besides, the kingdom benefits when leadership includes multiple perspectives, rather than relying on single individuals to make all important decisions. Their engagement, announced 6 months after the conspiracy's collapse, was celebrated throughout the realm as proof that justice could triumph over corruption, while love could emerge from the ashes of systematic cruelty. The wedding preparations became occasions for demonstrating how royal ceremonies could honor both tradition and innovation. Lady Sera insists on writing her own vows, Father Benedict reported with amusement, rather than reciting standard promises of obedience and submission. She says that words matter, particularly for someone who was forced into silence for so many years. And what does she propose instead? Promises of partnership, mutual support, shared responsibility for each other's welfare and the kingdom's needs. Also commitment to ensuring that their children grow up understanding that love multiplies strength rather than creating weakness. The day of their wedding dawned clear and bright, with celebrations that included not only nobles but common folk whose participation demonstrated how thoroughly the kingdom's priorities had shifted toward inclusivity rather than rigid hierarchy. Sera's vows, delivered in voice that carried across the cathedral without trembling, marked final victory over years of enforced silence. "I promise to stand beside you in both prosperity and adversity," she declared, "to offer counsel when wisdom requires multiple perspectives, to provide comfort when leadership demands difficult choices, and to ensure that power serves justice rather than personal convenience." Kieran's responding vows acknowledged not only their personal commitment, but the principles that would guide their shared rule. "I promise to protect not only you, but all who depend on royal justice, to listen when others bring concerns that challenge my assumptions, to remember that authority exists to serve those who grant it, rather than those who exercise it." The ceremony concluded with innovations that honored Sera's unique role. Rather than simply receiving a crown as royal consort, she was invested with specific responsibilities for protecting vulnerable populations while serving as formal advocate for those whose voices might otherwise go unheard. "Queen Sera," Father Benedict announced as the final blessing was pronounced, "guardian of the innocent, voice of the silent, partner in governance of this realm according to principles of justice, tempered with mercy." As celebrations continued throughout the day and into the evening, the royal couple found moments for private reflection on how far they had traveled from the night when systematic torture was disguised as household discipline. "Do you ever regret the complexity that our relationship has brought to royal duties?" Sera asked, as they watched dancing from the dais that elevated them above but not apart from their subjects. "Never," Kieran replied with absolute certainty. "Everything we've built together, the reforms, the protections, the changes in how authority operates, has made this a better kingdom than the one I inherited. Personal happiness was never supposed to be part of kingship, but discovering that it strengthens rather than weakens leadership has been the most valuable lesson of my reign. And the future? The future holds whatever challenges we'll face together, with the knowledge that love and justice can triumph over evil when people prove willing to risk everything for principles that matter more than personal comfort." As night settled over their realm, Alpha King Kieran and Queen Sera began the next chapter of their shared story, confident that foundations built on genuine partnership could support whatever tests the years ahead might bring. Chapter 22. The Protector's Crown. 1 year after their wedding, Alpha King Kieran and Queen Sera had established new traditions of governance that balanced royal authority with systematic protection of vulnerable populations. Their partnership had proven that shared leadership could be more effective than traditional hierarchical models, particularly when addressing complex social problems that required both strength and compassion. The quarterly reports show remarkable progress, Queen Sera announced during the council session that had become a forum for collaborative decision-making rather than royal decree. Incidents of servant abuse have decreased by 70%. Refugee integration programs have been expanded to 12 additional provinces, and the new legal protections have been adopted by 6 neighboring kingdoms. The success exceeded even optimistic projections, demonstrating that systematic attention to protecting the powerless created ripple effects that strengthened society at multiple levels. Former victims became advocates, reformed institutions became models for broader change, and the kingdom's reputation attracted alliances based on shared values rather than mere political convenience. Military reports also reflect positive developments, Sir Geoffrey added, his role having evolved into coordination of both external defense and internal security. Border raids have decreased significantly as word spreads that our realm provides genuine sanctuary for refugees while maintaining strong defenses against exploitation. Alpha King Kieran observed these developments with satisfaction that went beyond administrative achievement to encompass personal fulfillment and leadership that served purposes larger than mere power. The transformation of his own role from isolated authority to collaborative partnership had enhanced rather than diminished his effectiveness as a ruler. What challenges remain? Implementation requires constant vigilance, Queen Sera replied honestly. Some regions still resist changes that challenge traditional patterns of authority, while others struggle with resource limitations that make comprehensive reforms difficult to sustain. And external pressures? Prince Marcus continues attempts to undermine our influence through diplomatic channels, reported Lord Garrett, whose loyalty during the conspiracy had earned him elevation to chief advisor. However, his arguments about royal weakness have been contradicted by evidence of increased stability and prosperity throughout our territories. The failed invasion had permanently damaged Prince Marcus's credibility, while demonstrating that kingdoms built on justice could be more resilient than those maintained through fear and oppression. Other foreign powers had adjusted their strategies accordingly, seeking alliance rather than conquest with a realm that had proven its internal strength. But the afternoon brought news that tested their commitment to protective principles in ways they hadn't anticipated. A messenger arrived with reports that systematically abused servants from neighboring territories were fleeing in increasing numbers to seek sanctuary in Kieran's kingdom, creating practical challenges that could strain resources while triggering diplomatic complications. Over 300 refugees this month alone, Captain Bradford reported. All claim persecution by masters who learned of our protective policies and increased their own cruelty to prevent servant defections. The situation presented ethical dilemmas with no easy solutions. Refusing sanctuary would betray their principles, while accepting unlimited refugees could overwhelm their capacity to provide genuine help. Moreover, neighboring rulers were beginning to view refugee acceptance as hostile interference in their internal affairs. We cannot turn away people seeking protection from systematic abuse, Queen Sera declared firmly, but we also need sustainable approaches that address root causes rather than simply managing symptoms. The discussion that followed produced innovative solutions that reflected their partnership's strength. Expansion of educational programs that could be shared with neighboring kingdoms, diplomatic initiatives that offered technical assistance for implementing protective reforms, and gradual development of international standards that made systematic abuse diplomatically costly rather than merely morally questionable. Queen Sera will lead a delegation to the Continental Council, Alpha King Kieran announced, where she can present evidence about the connections between domestic justice and regional stability. Personal testimony from someone who survived systematic abuse while developing expertise in prevention may prove more persuasive than theoretical arguments. The mission represented significant expansion of her role from domestic advocate to international spokesperson for principles that transcended individual kingdoms. Her unique combination of personal experience and noble education made her ideally suited for convincing foreign rulers that protecting vulnerable populations served their own interests rather than merely satisfying abstract moral obligations. And if they refuse to implement protective reforms, then we continue providing sanctuary while demonstrating that kingdoms built on justice prosper more than those maintained through oppression. Queen Sera replied with confidence that had been earned through years of personal growth and professional success. Eventually, practical results will prove more persuasive than diplomatic pressure. As preparations began for what would become a transformative diplomatic initiative, both rulers reflected on how personal crises had evolved into institutional change that was beginning to influence civilization itself. Their individual suffering and triumph had become a model for addressing systemic problems that affected countless people throughout the known world. "Do you ever wonder," Queen Sera asked during one of their private conversations, "whether everything we've accomplished might not have been possible without the particular combination of experiences that brought us together?" "Often," Alpha King Kieran replied thoughtfully. "Your suffering provided insight into problems I never would have recognized on my own, while my authority provided means for implementing solutions you understood but couldn't have achieved independently." Partnership is more than personal satisfaction, then. Collaboration that serves purposes neither of us could accomplish alone. Exactly. Which suggests that love and justice aren't separate goals, but different aspects of the same fundamental commitment to ensuring that power serves those who need protection, rather than those who exercise authority. Their relationship had become a living demonstration that the strongest foundations for leadership were built on genuine care for others rather than desire for personal advantage. That true authority came from willingness to sacrifice for principles that transcended individual welfare. Chapter 23. The Legacy. 5 years after Alpha King Kieran and Queen Sera's wedding, their kingdom had become a beacon of hope for oppressed peoples throughout the known world, while serving as a model for governance that balanced strength with compassion. The systematic reforms they had implemented had created institutional changes that would outlast their individual reigns, while inspiring similar transformations in neighboring realms. The International Protection Accords have been signed by 18 kingdoms, Queen Sera reported during the anniversary celebration of their wedding, which had become an annual recommitment to the principles that governed their rule. Each signatory commits to specific standards for treating vulnerable populations, while accepting oversight from neutral observers who monitor compliance. The diplomatic achievement represented the transformation of personal trauma into universal standards that protected countless people who would never know how one woman's suffering had catalyzed changes that improved their lives. Queen Sera's testimony before foreign courts had proved remarkably effective in convincing rulers that systematic abuse created instability that threatened their own interests. Military alliances have also evolved, Sir Geoffrey added, his own role having expanded to coordinate international cooperation in defending realms that prioritized justice over mere power. The Mutual Defense League now includes 12 kingdoms committed to protecting each other against conquest by those who would restore oppressive practices. Alpha King Kieran observed these developments with pride that encompassed not only their achievements, but the collaborative process that had made such success possible. Leadership shared between partners who brought different strengths to common purposes had proven more effective than traditional hierarchical models. More importantly, he said, addressing assembled nobles and foreign dignitaries who had come to witness their anniversary celebrations, we've demonstrated that kingdoms built on justice and mercy can be stronger rather than weaker than those maintained through fear and oppression. The evidence was undeniable. Economic prosperity that came from treating all subjects fairly, military effectiveness that resulted from soldiers who fought for principles they believed in, diplomatic influence that emerged from moral authority rather than mere threats. Their kingdom had become more powerful by choosing to protect the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. But the afternoon brought personal news that added an intimate dimension to their public achievements. Dr. Edmund's examination confirmed what Queen Sera had suspected for several weeks. After years of healing from trauma that had made pregnancy seem impossible, she was expecting their first child. The physical recovery has been sufficient to support a healthy pregnancy, the physician assured them during his private consultation. Emotionally, the confidence and security she's developed provide an excellent foundation for motherhood. The announcement, shared with their closest friends and advisors, was received with joy that reflected both personal affection and recognition of what their child would represent. An heir born to parents who had overcome systematic abuse while creating institutions designed to prevent such suffering would inherit a realm transformed by their love and commitment to justice. What kind of world will we leave our child? Queen Sera wondered during one of their evening conversations as autumn painted the countryside in shades of gold and crimson. A world where systematic abuse faces systematic resistance, Alpha King Kieran replied, placing his hand over hers where it rested on her still flat abdomen. Where vulnerable people have legal protections backed by institutional support, where leadership is understood as service rather than domination, and where children grow up learning that strength comes from protecting others rather than exploiting them. Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret, now elevated to official royal advisor despite her humble origins, who brought reports about the day's most significant development: formal request from Prince Marcus of Westmarch for assistance in implementing protective reforms throughout his own territory. He claims that continued resistance to change has proven economically costly while diplomatically isolating, Margaret reported with satisfaction that reflected years of patient work to achieve such recognition. Apparently, systematic oppression has become too expensive to maintain when neighboring kingdoms offer better alternatives. The irony was perfect. The enemy who had once tried to exploit their kingdom's supposed weakness was now seeking assistance in implementing the same reforms he had previously condemned as evidence of unfit leadership. Prince Marcus's conversion might be motivated by pragmatism rather than principle, but the practical effects would still benefit his people. We'll provide technical assistance, Queen Sera decided, while ensuring that implementation includes genuine oversight rather than mere cosmetic changes designed to improve diplomatic appearances. As evening settled over their realm, Alpha King Kieran and Queen Sera reflected on how personal crisis had evolved into institutional transformation that was beginning to reshape civilization itself. Their individual journey from trauma to triumph had become a foundation for changes that would protect countless people throughout the generations to come. Our child will inherit problems we haven't solved, Queen Sera observed, but also tools we've developed and principles we've established. Perhaps each generation builds on what previous ones accomplished while addressing challenges that couldn't have been anticipated. And perhaps, Alpha King Kieran added, the greatest legacy we can leave is the knowledge that love and justice can triumph over evil when people prove willing to risk everything for principles that matter more than personal comfort. Their love story had become their kingdom story, proving that the most powerful revolutions often begin with individual choices to protect the innocent, rather than accept the convenient lies that enable systematic cruelty to flourish in darkness. Chapter 24. The Circle. Complete. 10 years after the crisis that had nearly destroyed both Alpha King Kieran's reign and Queen Sera's life, their kingdom celebrated the 10th anniversary of their wedding, with ceremonies that honored not only their personal relationship, but the transformation of civilization that their partnership had catalyzed. The assembled dignitaries included representatives from 27 kingdoms that had implemented protective reforms based on models developed through their collaborative leadership. The International Court for Protection of Vulnerable Populations has processed over 12,000 cases, Queen Sera announced during the formal address that had become traditional for these anniversary celebrations. Justice has been served for victims who previously had no voice, while systematic abusers have learned that their actions carry consequences, regardless of their social position. The achievement represented institutionalization of principles that had emerged from personal trauma, creating permanent structures that would continue protecting innocent people long after their individual reigns ended. Queen Sera's evolution from tortured servant to international advocate demonstrated how individual healing could serve universal purposes. Military cooperation has eliminated 3 attempts at conquest by rulers who sought to restore oppressive practices, Sir Geoffrey reported. His own transformation from loyal guard to international coordinator, reflecting how the crisis had revealed unexpected potential in many people. The Mutual Defense League now includes territories spanning 2 continents, united by commitment to justice rather than mere political convenience. Alpha King Kieran watched these proceedings with deep satisfaction that encompassed both public achievement and private fulfillment. Their 9-year-old daughter Elena played quietly in the royal gardens visible through the Great Hall's windows, living proof that love could triumph over trauma while creating new life that embodied hope for continued progress. Elena had inherited her mother's violet eyes and her father's strength of character, growing up in a world where protection of vulnerable people was understood as normal rather than exceptional. Her childhood education included stories about how systematic cruelty had once been disguised as necessary discipline, ensuring that future generations would recognize and resist such perversions of authority. "Mother," Elena had asked recently, "why do some people hurt others who can't fight back?" "Because power can corrupt people who forget that authority exists to serve others rather than themselves," Queen Sera had explained patiently. "That's why we have laws and institutions designed to protect those who need help, and why leadership requires constant vigilance against the temptation to use strength for personal advantage." The conversation had taken place in the same chamber where Morgana had once conducted her systematic torture, now transformed into Elena's schoolroom where she learned mathematics, languages, history, and ethics from tutors who understood that education should build character as well as knowledge. The symbolic transformation from place of suffering to center of learning embodied their kingdom's evolution. But the anniversary also brought sobering reminders that progress required eternal vigilance. Reports from border regions indicated new forms of abuse that exploited legal technicalities to avoid prosecution, while some neighboring kingdoms had implemented only superficial reforms designed to satisfy diplomatic requirements without genuinely protecting vulnerable populations. "Corruption adapts to resistance," Queen Sera observed during their private reflection that evening. "Each victory requires new strategies to address challenges we couldn't have anticipated." "Which suggests that the work we've begun will never be truly complete," Alpha King Kieran replied. "Each generation will inherit both the progress previous ones achieved and the responsibility to address problems that continue evolving." They stood together on the battlements where he had once walked alone, contemplating burdens that seemed too heavy for individual shoulders. Now those same walls enclosed a kingdom where systematic protection of innocent people had become as natural as breathing, where their daughter could grow up expecting justice rather than hoping for mere survival. "Do you ever regret the path that brought us here?" Queen Sera asked, her hand finding his as they watched moonlight silver the countryside that stretched beyond their castle walls. "Never," he replied with absolute certainty. "Everything we've accomplished together, the reforms, the protections, the changes in how authority operates, has created something more valuable than personal happiness, though that happiness makes everything else possible." "And what are we leaving for Elena?" "Tools for continuing the work, principles that can guide future decisions, and the knowledge that love and justice can triumph over evil when people prove willing to sacrifice comfort for courage." Below them, the kingdom slept peacefully under protection that had been bought with years of struggle against forces that preferred darkness to light, oppression to justice, exploitation to service. Their love story had become humanity's story, proving that individual choices to protect the innocent could reshape civilization itself. Queen Sera's journey from tortured servant to international advocate demonstrated that the human spirit could transform any suffering into strength when given proper support and opportunity. Alpha King Kieran's evolution from isolated ruler to collaborative leader showed that true authority came from serving others rather than dominating them. Together, they had discovered that the greatest victories were won not through conquest, but through creation of institutions that would outlast individual reigns while protecting countless people, who would never know the names of those who had sacrificed to ensure their safety. Chapter 25. Forever Changed. 20 years had passed since Alpha King Kieran first glimpsed scars that revealed systematic torture hidden behind the facade of household discipline, and the kingdom he ruled bore little resemblance to the realm that had once enabled such cruelty through willful blindness and convenient silence. The anniversary of Queen Sera's rescue had become a national holiday, celebrating the triumph of justice over oppression, observed throughout the known world as inspiration for continued vigilance against abuse of power. The University of Protective Studies graduates its third class this year. Queen Sera reported during the council session that had evolved into collaborative governance involving representatives from every level of society. Students from 43 kingdoms now study methods for identifying, preventing, and addressing systematic abuse while developing skills for building more just institutions. The educational achievement represented the transformation of personal trauma into universal knowledge that would protect future generations from suffering similar persecution. Elena, now 29 and serving as crown princess, had contributed to curriculum development while preparing to inherit responsibility for continuing their work. Princess Elena's research on economic factors that enable abuse has been particularly valuable, Sir Geoffrey noted, his own children now serving in positions throughout the expanding network of protective institutions. Her findings demonstrate how poverty, isolation, and legal inequality create conditions that systematic abusers exploit for their own purposes. Alpha King Kieran, his hair now silver but his commitment to justice undiminished, watched these proceedings with gratitude that encompassed both public achievement and private satisfaction. Margaret, though retired from daily duties, continued providing wisdom gained through decades of observing how individual kindness could catalyze institutional transformation. The old cook was right, Queen Sera often reflected when they visited Margaret's comfortable cottage overlooking the gardens, where a traumatized girl had once been found half dead from grief and starvation. Sometimes the most important changes begin with simple human decency rather than grand political strategies. Elena's marriage to Prince David of Eastmarch had created new diplomatic alliances built on shared commitment to protective principles rather than mere political convenience. Their children, Kieran's grandchildren, were growing up in a world where systematic abuse was recognized as crime rather than acceptable discipline, where vulnerable people had legal recourse rather than silent suffering. Grandfather, his 6-year-old grandson Marcus had asked recently, "Why do we have so many laws about protecting people who are smaller or weaker?" "Because strong people sometimes forget that their strength should be used to help others rather than hurt them," Kieran had explained. "Laws remind everyone what proper behavior looks like while providing consequences for those who choose cruelty over kindness." The conversation had taken place in the memorial garden dedicated to victims of systematic abuse who hadn't survived long enough to see justice triumph. Stone markers bore names when known, simple inscriptions when identities had been lost, eternal flames that honored suffering while promising that such darkness would never again be dismissed as necessary discipline. Queen Sera visited the memorial regularly, particularly on difficult days when reports of continued abuse in distant kingdoms reminded her that progress remained incomplete despite decades of systematic effort. Her own healing had been thorough, but not without occasional setbacks that required patient attention and mutual support. "The scars are still there," she would tell young advocates who sought her guidance about recovering from trauma while building strength for future service. "Physical ones fade, but memories remain. The difference is that pain no longer defines who I am. It simply informs the work I do to prevent others from suffering similarly." Her words had been carved into stone at the memorial's center, providing inspiration for visitors who needed hope that individual suffering could serve universal purposes when transformed through love and commitment to justice. But the evening brought private celebration of personal milestones that made public achievements meaningful on human rather than merely institutional levels. Elena's announcement that she was expecting her third child provided joy that connected past struggles to future hopes while demonstrating how cycles of trauma could be broken through conscious choice and systematic effort. Our grandchildren will inherit a world we could barely imagine during the darkest periods, Queen Sera observed as they walked through gardens that bloomed with varieties from every kingdom that had joined their protective alliance. Not perfect, but infinitely better than what we experienced. And they'll face challenges we can't anticipate, Alpha King Kieran added, but with tools we've helped develop and principles we've worked to establish. Perhaps that's what progress actually looks like. Each generation building on previous achievements while addressing problems that continue evolving. As night settled over their realm, they stood together on battlements that had witnessed transformation from isolation to collaboration, from willful blindness to systematic vigilance, from individual suffering to institutional protection. The kingdom spread below them carried their names, but embodied principles that transcended any single reign or generation. "What are you thinking about?" Queen Sera asked, noting the contemplative expression that had become familiar over 2 decades of shared leadership. "That scars tell stories," he replied, echoing words she had spoken years earlier. "Yours say you survived systematic cruelty and transformed that survival into protection for countless others. They remind us that the strongest foundations are built not despite trauma, but because of how trauma can be transmuted into wisdom and strength." "And yours?" she asked, touching the barely visible mark on his hand where a blade had cut him during the rescue that changed everything. "Mine say, I learned to see what I had missed, to act when action was required, to risk everything for principles that mattered more than personal comfort. They remind me that true authority comes from willingness to sacrifice for those who depend on royal protection." Together, they had discovered that love was indeed the most powerful force for transformation, capable of healing individuals while reshaping civilization itself. Their story continued in daily choices made by people throughout the known world who had learned that protecting the innocent was not weakness but the highest expression of strength. The servant who had been tortured in darkness had become a queen who brought light to the farthest corners of human cruelty. The king who had ruled through comfortable distance had become a protector who understood that genuine authority required constant vigilance against the temptation to use power for personal advantage rather than universal service. Their love had saved not only themselves but countless others whose names they would never know, whose suffering they had prevented, whose children would grow up in a world where systematic abuse was no longer tolerated in silence. The circle was complete, but the work would continue forever, carried forward by those who understood that the price of justice was eternal vigilance against forces that preferred darkness to light, oppression to freedom, cruelty to love. Their legacy lived not in monuments or chronicles, but in the daily choices of ordinary people who had learned that extraordinary courage was simply the decision to protect others when protection was needed most.